Whispers ran through the kingdom regarding a shadowy, legendary entity. It was said that beneath a crimson curtain sat a black box where anyone could submit a desire or contract, summoning a clandestine force known throughout the land. Beneath the pale glow of the moon, this secret syndicate operated in darkness. They were an enigmatic cadre of assassins known only as the Night Dwellers, striking silently and without trace. Meanwhile, under the clear sky of the capital, a group of guard trainees gathered at the courtyard grounds, watching the conclusion of a high-stakes sparring match. To everyone's shock, the renowned sword saint, Goodfried, calmly conceded defeat after 5 brutal rounds. The surrounding trainees stood stunned, marveling that even a master of his stature could lose a duel. Amidst the flurry of excitement, he rested his chin in his hands with a completely indifferent expression. This was Rue, a young trainee assigned to the Eastern Gate City Guard Unit 11, utterly unfazed by the spectacle. His fellow guards babbled animatedly about how Basaka had stood no chance, speculating that rising political tensions were bringing dangerous mercenaries like the Silver Wolf and Demon Cutter into the open. Their conversation turned to darker rumors, whispering about forgotten magic and mysterious deaths linked to the Night Dwellers. While some dismissed it as mere superstition, others insisted that an ominous threat was creeping closer. Interrupting their chatter, the vice captain modestly explained that he had taken this teaching assignment as a personal favor for Captain Sykes of the Royal Guard, dismissing their lavish praise with a quiet laugh. Inspired by his presence, the young recruits bowed deeply, thrilled by the rare honor of learning under a master who was preparing to instruct the Crown Prince himself. He watched in silence as the energetic recruit burst into dramatic, sarcastic praise, wildly exaggerating his gratitude. As the master tried to walk away, the mischievous youth squirmed across the floor, continuing his childish imitations. Clinging stubbornly to his side, the recruit's relentless antics only confirmed the master's initial impression of him as a troublemaker. The youth kept pestering him continuously until the vice captain finally turned around with a sharp, exasperated glare. Losing his patience, the sword saint barked that the chaotic trainee urgently required strict physical discipline. Demanding quiet, he ignored the youth's frantic arguments that training a hopeless recruit was a waste of valuable time. The veteran reasoned that elevating the unit's weakest link would ultimately elevate the strength of the entire guard. Assessing the boy's posture, the commander was appalled by his slouched shoulders, weak stance, and utter lack of core balance. Nervous and sweating profusely, the recruit pleaded for gentleness, but the master sternly ordered him not to retreat. Announcing his advance, the sword saint stepped forward, sending the terrified youth leaping backward in sheer panic. He launched a furious attack without holding back, his swift blade whistling through the air and forcing the terrified recruit to scream out in sheer panic. Despite the overwhelming speed of the strike, the boy instinctively twisted away, barely escaping the edge of the weapon as his opponent watched with sharp concentration. The momentum sent him crashing onto the dirt, sprawling helplessly on the ground, while the watching recruits broke into boisterous laughter at his awkward fall. Whining from the pain, he began crawling pitifully along the dirt, desperately begging anyone nearby to carry him back to the barracks. Unmoved by his dramatic display, the vice captain simply commanded him to stand up straight and prepare to cook, leaving the senior guard to sigh at his hopeless antics. As his senior dragged him away by the collar while he complained about the master picking on him, the vice captain quietly realized that the boy's dodging was no mere fluke. He was actively reading the trajectory of high-level sword strokes. Stepping forward, the senior guard bowed politely and apologized for the recruit's lack of composure, prompting the vice captain to ask for the strange boy's name once more. Far beyond the training grounds stood the fortified walls of Santogon, the proud capital city of Froynvale, a small kingdom striving to maintain its neutrality amidst global conflict. Here on the eastern side of the nation, the young guard recruit continued his ordinary daily routine, unaware of the subtle attention he had drawn. However, his peaceful walk through the town was suddenly interrupted when his energetic young sister called out to him in startled concern. She quickly offered an apology to the senior guard for her brother's foolish antics, explaining that he had merely lost his balance. The guard greeted her warmly in return, while Rue grumbled in embarrassment. Seizing the light-hearted moment, The guard casually asked for permission to marry Misha, to which Ray nonchalantly agreed without hesitation. The sudden declaration left her completely dumbfounded, shocked that her own brother would give her away so easily. Leaning in with an insufferable smirk, he added his one condition. The suitor would have to take him along as extra baggage. Both Misha and the guard stared back at him in sheer disbelief at his shameless, freeloading ambitions. Exasperated, she began listing all of his terrible habits at home, complaining about how he never wakes up on his own, leaves his clothes scattered everywhere, and acts completely helpless. She grabbed at his hair in frustration, declaring his domestic incompetence utterly pathetic. Watching him lounge lazily on the floor, the senior guard joined in on the criticism, pointing out his disastrous sword training and warning that he was on track to become a lifelong dependent. Rather than feeling insulted, he welcomed the idea with open arms. She crossed her arms in disapproval, admitting that the thought of taking care of such an unmotivated brother forever filled her with dread. The guard grumbled as well, amazed at the young man's complete lack of shame. Preparing to depart for his night patrol, the guard bid farewell to his future brother-in-law, urging him to work hard in his absence. As he stepped out into the street, he let out a heavy sigh over the grueling duty ahead. Before heading off, he called back to remind the boy that while free food might suit a cute pet, a grown guard trainee needed to earn his keep. The young man squawked in protest, rejecting the comparison to a stray cat. As the senior guard walked down the quiet street, his tone softened into quiet concern, admitting that he only took on extra night shifts because it was just him and his mother, and he felt obligated to support her. Meanwhile, the boy watched him walk away with a subtle stretch. Hearing those heartfelt words, the boy fell silent for a moment before poking fun at his friend for trying to sound cool. The guard shot back defensively, declaring that there was nothing wrong with simply wanting to make his mother happy. He couldn't resist poking fun at his senior's devotion, teasingly calling him a dedicated family man, while laughingly declaring he wouldn't offer him any sympathy. Reacting with embarrassed outrage, the young girl shrieked before urging the departing guard to stay safe on his night rounds, while promises were exchanged to fix up the damaged entrance later. As the night deepened, cold winds swept through the quiet, looming alleyways of the city, casting long shadows under the pale moonlight. Navigating the dark streets with his lantern in hand, the senior guard reflected that he would never walk these alleys at night if it weren't for work, mindful of chilling rumors about deadly killers roaming the shadows. Joined by fellow patrolmen along the narrow stone path, they noted how quiet the city became at night, casually shifting their banter toward lighter topics like a newly opened bar in the red light district. As they chuckled over rumors regarding a striking new waitress at the establishment, a sudden, heavy metallic click echoed down the alleyway, halting their conversation instantly. Turning their gaze toward a pitch-black passage marked by suspicious bloodstains along the wall, the guard squad froze in startled tension as an unseen presence stirred within the darkness. An arm reached out to halt the young guard as heavy footsteps echoed through the shadowy alleyway. His heart pounded violently in his chest, sweat dripping down his face as a horrifying thought seized him. Could the murderer be approaching them right now in the dark? But the figure stepping into the dim light was no hidden killer, but Vice Captain Goodfried himself, leaving the gate guard stunned to encounter the legendary sword sane on patrol at such an hour. He casually explained that rumors of the recent murders had reached his ears, and he felt compelled to wander the streets in hopes of intercepting whatever threat lurked in the night. After offering to join their night patrol, he fell into step beside them, leaving the young trainee inwardly grumbling about having to play escort to the strongest swordsman in the area. As they moved down the narrow street, the veteran swordsman turned the conversation toward the reality of martial training, pointing out that no matter how rigorously one practices, every warrior eventually hits an impassable wall. Intrigued by the statement, the young trainee looked up and directly asked how one is supposed to overcome such a barrier when standard effort is no longer enough. The master paused for a fraction of a second, his expression hardening as he prepared to deliver a simple, chilled response. The secret to pushing beyond human limits, he revealed with dark certainty, was to take human life in battle. As a chilling image of ruthless slashes flashed through his mind, the young guard stood frozen in disbelief, utterly stunned by the cold, terrifying truth behind the sword saint's power. He staggered back in utter disbelief as the vice captain calmly reiterated the brutal essence of breaking physical limits: to cut, and keep on cutting without hesitation. Before the young trainee could process those chilling words, the master drew his sword in a blinding flash, executing a swift, lethal arc through the dark air. That sudden strike evoked a nightmare of violence, where a dying young warrior gasped his final words to his mother, while his killer coldly proclaimed that taking a life was the only true path to greater power. The horrifying imagery intensified as broken bodies lay strewn across the blood-soaked ground, their desperate pleas for help fading unanswered into the night. Unmoved by the ghastly spectral vision of slaughter, the veteran master simply narrowed his eyes, his cold gaze fixed intently ahead. With a fluid motion, he sheathed his steel and quietly surveyed the silent alley, wondering if the lethal intent lingering in the air was merely a trick of his senses. Meanwhile, the overwhelming shock took its toll on the youth, leaving him hyperventilating on his knees as the gruesome reality of combat settled heavily upon his mind. Doubled over on the stone ground, he groaned in agony, unable to banish the haunting realization of what becoming stronger truly demanded. In stark contrast to his internal turmoil, the senior guards examined the distinct sword marks left behind, concluding that this killer was not the same slasher who had murdered the young man's father, but a dangerous new threat altogether. Inspecting the grim sight closer, their suspicions were shattered by tragedy as they found the lifeless body of Lexi's mother collapsed in the dirt, confirming a killer was actively hunting in the district. As he stood paralyzed by the horrors of the scene, the mother's unbearable grief boiled over into violent rage. Screaming at the guards that merely arresting the culprit would never be enough, she demanded they be killed. Driven beyond the brink of sanity, the distraught woman begged anyone listening to summon the elusive night dwellers, pleading for her child's murderer to suffer an agonizing fate far worse than death itself. Overwhelmed by her agonized screams echoing in his ears, he stumbled away into the quiet streets, clutching his head in a futile effort to silence the despair. Throughout the bustling district, whispers of the sinister vigilantes quickly spread among the townsfolk, passing the dark name from mouth to mouth. Meanwhile, left behind in her sorrow, the mourning woman wept bitterly, questioning why such cruelty had fallen upon her innocent child and calling out for Rue. Dazed and unsteady on her feet, she aimlessly wandered into a secluded side street, her grief blinding her to her surroundings. Suddenly, a strange hooded child stepped out from the shadows, murmuring cryptic instructions to head down a nameless street at dusk if she wished to find what she sought. Before she could even ask who the strange child was, a faint chime rang out, and the mysterious messenger vanished into thin air, leaving her bewildered in the quiet alley. Following the cryptic words, she searched the nearby streets for a doorway marked with a curtain depicting a drawn sword, but found nothing fitting the description. Realizing the bitter truth of her fruitlessness, she began to wonder if the legendary vigilantes were nothing more than a myth invented by the desperate. She wept uncontrollably, burying her face in her hands as the agonizing grief over her lost son overwhelmed her remaining composure. Looking up through her tears, her eyes widened as she recalled the mysterious instructions about the crimson curtain and the sword shadow cast by the setting sun. The strange words whispered to her earlier returned to her mind, framing an urban legend she had once dismissed as mere myth. Underneath the crimson drape bearing the dark silhouette of the Sword of Judgment, the ritual required offering a price and reciting the secret incantation. Driven by utter desperation, she collapsed onto her knees upon the cold cobblestones, ready to initiate the dangerous contact. With trembling breath, she prepared to speak the hidden words that would summon the shadowy vigilantes into her world. "Draw a line for me," she uttered into the quiet air, invoking the binding phrase of the night dwellers. An unseen presence responded from behind the hanging curtain, prompting her to voice her desire, to which she frantically begged for the death of her child's murderer. She pledged everything she owned, every coin saved for her son's future, willingly accepting whatever tragic price or punishment might follow so long as the monster suffered. The small messenger pondered who should be assigned to the contract, observing that certain grieving souls simply cannot move forward without closure. Before any assignment could be finalized, a dark silhouette stepped forward, casually claiming the job for himself. The messenger questioned if such a task was beneath someone of his caliber, warning that mixing personal feelings with work was far from admirable, though he pleaded to indulge himself just this once. Accepting his stubborn desire, the figure finally relented, agreeing to the operative taking on the contract was none other than Rue, an S-class assassin operating under the guise of a guard trainee, feared as the absolute worst among the night dwellers. High tension filled the guard quarters as angry recruits confronted their commander, distraught over their fallen comrade Ryuji and demanding action despite warnings about the demon. The commander countered their outburst, explaining that they could not afford more casualties while awaiting reinforcement from the other 3 units, even as a desperate soldier begged for a little more time. As arguments flared over whether sheer numbers could overcome such a monster, the commotion failed to hold the interest of the young warrior standing nearby. He quietly turned toward the exit, prompting the surrounding men to question where he was going without a scheduled patrol, to which he nonchalantly replied that he was heading home to sleep. Hearing this, the commander pressed him on his apparent lack of concern for their dead comrades as he continued walking toward the door. Without pausing, the young swordsman coldly remarked that once someone is dead, everything is over for them. He added that trying to act now was nothing more than self-satisfaction since the fallen would never return, before stepping out into the hallway. Behind him, the outraged guards yelled curses at his heartlessness, though his pragmatic perspective left a deep impression on a younger recruit. A profound darkness shadowed his eyes as he departed, quietly resolved that from this moment on, his actions were driven solely by his own self-satisfaction. As night falls around him, the townspeople hurry into their homes, bolting their doors and dousing their lights in fear of what lurks in the dark. In the suffocating dark that follows, fear grips the village, for the night belongs entirely to lethal monsters. Walking the silent streets, Commander Sykes scans the empty alleyways, scoffing at how easily 3 soldiers fell without putting up a proper fight. His thoughts turn to the legend of the one-clash demon, whose terrifying reputation has already reached the royal castle, forcing the knights to mobilize. This ruthless warrior's journey began with an absolute obsession to master the sword, enduring countless defeats and endless training to transcend normal limits. Driven to reach higher heights regardless of the cost, he escalated from chaotic street brawls to refining his deadly craft over a mountain of fallen foes. With every life claimed in a single strike, his swordplay grew more refined, and his famed sword, sworn to make the name of Sword Saint Godfrey immortal. Embracing his murderous nature, he earned the fearsome title of the One-Clash Demon, leaving a bloody legacy in his wake. Even as formidable opponents, including Commander Sykes himself, converge to hunt him down, he welcomes the deadly conflict as a means to achieve ultimate mastery. Yet, as Sykes reflects on his quarry from the shadows, he finds it truly lamentable that such a monster displays no desire for personal revenge. He continued his nocturnal patrol through the quiet alleyways when a lonely figure in the distance caught his attention, prompting him to murmur at such carelessness. Approaching closer, a weary young traveler strolled past carrying a lantern, yawning heavily while unaware that the commander's sharp gaze was fixing upon him with sudden intrigue. As they struck up a casual conversation, the young man inquired about the night patrol while mentioning his visit to an acquaintance, casually lamenting how lower-ranking members were stuck doing the tedious work while everyone feared the legendary One-Clash Demon. Meanwhile, the commander silently recalled a fleeting encounter, remembering the unsettling killer's glare hidden behind the boy's unassuming exterior. The young man offered a light-hearted warning, noting that even a famed sword saint should remain cautious in such dangerous alleys. Turning away as if to part ways, the commander offered a grim reply, reminding him that one must never drop their guard. They passed each other silently under the moonlight, their footfalls steady on the cobblestones. Stepping further apart, the illusion of a peaceful encounter hung briefly in the cold night air. In a split second, an overwhelming killer aura exploded from behind the commander. Before the young traveler could react, the commander pivoted with terrifying velocity, drawing his blade and delivering a brutal strike straight across his torso. Looming coldly over the bleeding young man, the commander reiterated his warning with merciless conviction. He paused mid-movement, his eyes widening in surprise as a calm, youthful voice interrupted his sudden attack from behind, warning him to be more careful. In that fraction of a second, a sharp flash split the air, sending a lethal counterstrike slicing back directly toward him before he could complete his swing. The commander reeled back in utter shock, blood bursting from a massive slash across his upper torso, as the sheer force knocked him off balance. Stumbling violently against the alley walls, he choked on his own blood, unable to comprehend how someone could have moved behind him without leaving a trace. Collapsing onto the pavement, the dying officer spat blood onto the cold stone, realizing too late that his opponent was no ordinary target. Standing before him completely unscathed, the young swordsman revealed not a single tear on his clothes, leaving the fallen commander to realize his own deadly strike had been bounced back at him. Looking down cold-heartedly, the youth dismissed any notion of simple trickery, asking if the officer truly believed he was the only monster dwelling in the dark passageway. As life rapidly drained from his body, the commander could only gasp out in terror, desperately demanding to know the true identity of the warrior who had defeated him in a single instant. In the silence of the alleyway, the young warrior stood over the lifeless body, contemplating the curse of those who gain unnatural power that slowly devours their physical bodies. With an intense, deadly glare in his eyes, he accepted his grim legacy, proclaiming themselves to be the night dwellers who take back what was stolen from the weak. Standing over his defeated foe, he picked up a small token from the commander's fallen body, declaring his intention to strip away the man's most prized possession, his reputation. Reminding the bleeding officer of a warrior's pride, he pointed out that the fatal wound on his back carried the unmistakable signature technique of the vanished one-slash-demon. He taunted the dying man, noting that if word spread that the famed sword saint was struck down from behind while fleeing, his honor would be utterly destroyed. As the commander gasped his final breaths, the young swordsman proclaimed that he alone would serve as the witness to this disgrace, ensuring the world remembered the one-slash-demon as the one who struck down the sword saint without a trace. Silence settled over the darkened alley as wind whipped past his solitary figure. Looking down at the lifeless body with cold eyes, he delivered a final harsh curse, telling the fallen commander to carry his ruined honor into the afterlife. A few days later, he departed the scene, leaving the quiet alley in the shadow of the encounter far behind him. Meanwhile, inside a modest home, Hiker sighed softly as he folded his clothes, taking a brief moment of rest after days of uncertainty. Reflecting on recent events, the young noble recalled placing a request with the night dwellers to eliminate the serial killer, reasoning that the quiet streets meant his vengeance had finally been carried out. Just as he murmured to himself, the sound of the front door creaking open made him pause, turning his head toward the unexpected visitor standing in the entryway. Outside the barracks, a grieving mother prepared to depart, explaining that without her son remaining in the guard, she had no reason to stay. Godfrey insisted his presence was mere chance before offering to carry her heavy luggage to the carriage. Taking hold of the massive sack, he immediately felt its staggering weight pressing down on his shoulders. Though she expressed concern over his visible strain, he stubbornly brushed it off, determined to carry it himself. Continuing forward together, he helped haul the cumbersome burden toward the station. Stepping into the busy square, he guided her through the crowd of travelers toward the waiting horse-drawn coaches. He reached out and pressed a heavy pouch of money into her hands, the very payment previously given to the night dwellers. Seeing her confusion over the sudden gift, he softly explained that her late son, Ryu, had always wanted nothing more than her happiness. He looked at her with a calm, sincere expression, reminding her that unless she found peace in her own life, her son would never truly rest. Her eyes widened in quiet shock as the full truth and emotional weight of his words settled over her heart. Interrupted by the driver announcing their departure, he attentively helped her climb up onto the coach. As the coach pulled away, he offered a warm wave goodbye, calling out his final wishes for her safe journey. He stood quietly as the wooden wheels of the carriage churned against the dusty road, carrying its passengers away through the town's archway. Inside the vehicle, the woman found a gentle comfort among her fellow travelers, letting out a soft chuckle as the quiet journey began. Turning her head one last time with a warm, tranquil smile, she offered a silent farewell to the youth who had brought her peace. His eyes remained heavy and contemplative, reflecting the weight of the truth he had carried and successfully delivered. Left behind under the shadow of the grand stone ramparts, the wandering swordsman stood motionless until the carriage faded into the distance. Elsewhere, under the allure of the night, a seductive woman teased her companion, whispering that a mere kiss was only the spark of an unfolding new mystery. Outside the high stone walls of the East Gate, spring has arrived, bringing a gentle warmth and peaceful atmosphere to the surrounding countryside. High up in the lush canopy of a tree, a young guard lazily takes advantage of the quiet day to nap while his fellow soldiers continue their duties. Sitting comfortably against the trunk with his cloth-wrapped blade leaning beside him, he stretches out his arms, savoring the rare moment of peaceful idleness. Meanwhile, up on the patrol path, the squad captain calls an end to the day's duties, only for one of the guards to notice that the young boy is nowhere to be seen. Flabbergasted by the news, the commander turns around in a fit of rage and bellows out across the open fields toward the woods. Hearing his superior's thunderous voice booming across the distance demanding to know where he wandered off to, the boy snaps awake in sheer terror. Sweating profusely in panic, he desperately clutches his head, realizing in horror that he accidentally drifted off to sleep while on shift. As the adrenaline slowly fades, he overhears the other guards discussing dark rumors of looming war among neighboring nations, solemnly noting that if conflict breaks out, an apprentice like him, who joined to support his family after his father's death, will be sent directly to the front lines. While he hovered nearby, his captain and a fellow guard discussed the negative impact his slacking had on team morale, mentioning the ominous presence of the night dwellers. Hearing the dread term, he recoiled in sheer panic, tumbling backward while the two men watched his overreaction with complete indifference. Trembling with unease, the young guard cowered behind the unbothered captain, who merely stood impassive under his frantic gaze. A passerby called out to the captain, asking if he was working overtime, but the commander simply dismissed it, explaining he was merely lecturing his foolish subordinate. As they continued down the street, a local woman scolded the youth, telling him not to cause their commander any more trouble. Exhausted and stressed, he realized in panic that he wouldn't survive another round of harsh lectures or physical punishment. After enduring half an hour of relentless scolding that nearly blew out his eardrums, he lamented his shattered hopes of sneaking home early. The captain politely bid farewell to an elderly resident, then barked for the boy to hurry along, prompting the youngster to desperately rack his brain for a new topic to stall the impending nagging. Attempting small talk, he blurted out an inquiry about the captain's young daughter, only to receive a terrifying death glare and a lethal threat. Terrified by the captain's lethal intensity, he immediately backed off, sheepishly deciding it was best to pick a completely different subject. Desperate to shift the dangerous conversation away from the commander's daughter, he quickly pointed out the unique blade hanging from the captain's belt. Following his gaze, the captain explained that the blade, forged from a newly discovered refined steel, was crafted specifically for him by Ward, a blacksmith he frequented before taking his post with the guard. Curious about its durability after extended use, the young swordsman asked for a performance evaluation, prompting the captain to praise the metal as twice as hard as normal steel with exceptional edge retention. The commander mused that if every guard could be equipped with weapons forged from such remarkable steel, casualties in their ranks would plummet drastically. Smirking slightly at his superior's endless concern for his men, he remarked on how passionate the captain remained about his duties. However, when the topic turned to re-equipping the garrison, the captain solemnly revealed that the master blacksmith had died without teaching anyone his technique, making the existing dark green steel priceless and irreplaceable. Glancing side to side, the commander lowered his voice to confide that while official reports claimed a natural death, he secretly suspected the malevolent night dwellers were responsible. Skeptical of the explanation, the youth scoffed that blaming every tragedy on night dwellers was absurd, but the captain urged him to listen closely to the strange timeline. The blacksmith had perished just 7 days after handing over the sword. He explained that whenever the blacksmith worked on refining the dark green steel, he meticulously locked every door and window from within, yet one night he failed to emerge, prompting his daughter and apprentice to break down the barrier. Inside the sealed room lay the craftsman's lifeless body. While it initially appeared to be a sudden illness, a microscopic needle driven deep into the back of his neck revealed a far more sinister assassination. He walked beside the captain, listening solemnly as the officer concluded that such strange murders were typically the work of the night dwellers, leaving no surviving master who knew the secret to forging dark green steel. As they continued down the alley, a glamorous woman suddenly burst through a nearby doorway, shouting frantically for help, even as she secretly wondered if the deceased blacksmith had left behind written records of his techniques. She stood defiantly in the alleyway before a group of rough men, loudly accusing them of creating a scene and making an unwanted nuisance of themselves in public. She dramatized her distress, shouting at the men that a fragile young lady was being harassed, though her antagonists merely scoffed at her theatrics. Hiluluk stepped forward to clarify that they were only present to discuss an outstanding debt, but she refused to lower her voice, continuing to complain about being cornered by intimidating thugs. The imposing leader explained that the theatrical woman had intruded into the matter uninvited, pointing out that the debt actually belonged to a frightened girl hiding quietly behind her. Recognizing the captain's authority and unwilling to cause a major dispute, Hiluluk agreed to pull back his men for the day out of respect. He gaped in utter admiration at his leader, ecstatic at how smoothly the captain had resolved the tense confrontation without raising a weapon. Turning toward a nearby pile of debris, the captain yelled exasperatedly at another local guard who had been cowering in fear throughout the entire encounter. With the confrontation defused, the captain casually approached the glamorous woman to inquire if she had sustained any injuries during the commotion. He admonished the dancer for snapping so wildly at him, asking if she was some kind of mad dog, but she immediately shot back in defiance, refusing to let anyone look down on her just because she was a performer. Hearing her fiery spirit, he seemed satisfied, expressing relief that she was unharmed. Tempered by his calm response, she bowed her head sheepishly and offered a quiet apology, thanking him while reassuring everyone that neither she nor the young girl had suffered a single scratch. Introducing herself as Lim Lim, a traveling dancer, she presented the young girl standing beside her as Shia. The captain turned his attention to the child, recognizing her instantly. He explained to the group that it was no surprise they recognized one another, revealing that Shia was the daughter of Ward the blacksmith, who had frequently visited the guard post before his passing. Hearing her late father mentioned, the girl clutched her necklace in quiet sorrow. Suddenly breaking the somber mood, the captain delivered a sharp bonk to the young warrior's head. Rubbing his head in pain, the boy listened as his elder teased him about his lack of quick wit, which he could only reluctantly admit with a sigh. After the brief moment of levity, the young swordsman and Shia expressed their sincere gratitude for the captain's intervention. He brushed off their thanks dismissively, assuring them that it was merely part of his duty. As the tension fully dissolved, the young man suddenly caught sight of something, or someone, that completely froze him in his tracks. His gaze landed squarely on Shia's face, captivated by her beauty as an uncharacteristic thought crossed his mind. He found himself completely mesmerized by her striking features. Before he could dwell on the thought any longer, Lim Lim aggressively grabbed his head, scolding him for staring with such an unsettling and creepy expression. Flushing with embarrassment, the young warrior tried in vain to explain himself, but the captain only burst out laughing, entirely unconvinced by his flustered excuses. He listened as the dancer questioned Shia, who admitted she was completely bewildered by the sudden claims of debt. She explained that the men had confronted her at the shop without warning, claiming her late father owed them a massive debt prior to his passing. Following her explanation, Shia revealed that she had taken a job as a server in the entertainment district after her father's death, prompting Lim Lim to gently chime in that the establishment was respectable and somewhere she frequently performed. The young swordsman agreed that her ignorance was completely logical, while she reiterated that her father had never mentioned such a debt and that she lacked the means to pay them regardless. The situation struck a personal chord within him, causing his thoughts to drift to the disturbing prospect of losing his own family without warning. Returning his focus to the conversation, Captain Sykes observed that the debt collectors were likely targeting the secret research of her late father, specifically regarding the valuable dark green steel. She acknowledged the secret method her father had closely guarded from everyone, reserving it only for her younger brother in the future, but the captain warned her that the notorious thug known as Snake Hilialik would never abandon his pursuit. Realizing the ongoing danger, Sykes abruptly assigned the reluctant youth to serve as Shia's bodyguard starting the very next day, catching him completely off guard. He vehemently protested the order, questioning why he should risk encountering dangerous attackers again. But the captain barked back, asserting that field duty was the only way to mend his lazy attitude. When he attempted to excuse himself by claiming he needed to focus on his training, Sykes shut him down immediately, pointing out his habit of slacking off and sleeping through practice anyway. He gaped in utter shock, sweat dripping down his face as his superior coldly informed him that he was barred from returning to the guard station until the assignment was completed. Outraged, the young swordsman protested loudly, decrying the order as a flagrant abuse of authority. Left with no alternative, he crumpled to his knees in agony, letting out a dramatic cry of despair. Captain Sykes delivered a relentless ultimatum: accept the bodyguard duty to have his past slacking forgiven, or refuse and face grueling, endless training starting the very next morning. The family gathered around the warm dining table, sharing a rare moment of peace amidst their quiet routine. Resting her chin on her hand, the young girl confronted her brother about his upcoming assignment, demanding to know if he found her or the newcomer, Shia, more charming. Demanding a clear answer, she listened in disbelieving silence as he dramatically showered her with flattery, claiming her gentle smile could cause the sun itself to set in bashfulness. Her mother joined the conversation with a smirk, teasingly suggesting that only someone as unusual as her sister would ever harbor feelings for a strange fellow like him. The mother continued her teasing, remarking that he was actually quite charming upon closer inspection, prompting a flustered outburst from the young swordsman as he reminded her that he was her own son. Unfazed, his sister rattled off a blunt list of his shortcomings, describing his lifeless gaze and sneaky nature until he was forced to protest that her words were unnecessarily harsh. Defeated by their merciless banter, he slumped forward onto the table with a weary groan, muttering to himself about where she could have possibly inherited such a sharp tongue. Her mother simply offered a light-hearted smile, noting that neither parent was to blame, while the young girl softly asked her to let the matter rest. Holding that quiet moment close, she reflected on their true bond, remembering how their father had once promised that despite him being adopted into the family, sticking together would make them a real family forever. As she held onto the memory of her late father's words, her brother sighed to himself, complaining softly that their father had said far too much. Leaving home behind, he navigated through the artisan district, staring in disbelief at the horribly drawn map provided by his commander. Wandering through the unfamiliar winding streets, he wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, thoroughly confused by the vague directions. Spotting a shop marked with a cat sign, he leaned over the side counter to ask if anyone knew the whereabouts of the Ward workshop. To his utter bewilderment, a deep male voice answered back, shattering his assumption that the shop's name belonged to a young woman. Startled by the bizarre interaction, he stumbled back in sheer confusion, wondering if he had just encountered some strange imposter. His panic instantly evaporated when the young Lady Shia stepped into view, playfully welcoming her new bodyguard while he stammered out excuses about her intimidating guardian. She listened to his rambling with a serene expression before politely admitting she did not quite understand his sense of humor. Leading him toward a quaint cylindrical building surrounded by vibrant flowers, she somberly revealed that the workshop would be transferred to new owners within a month. She explained that her modest salary could never cover the maintenance of the vast mansion, nor could it fulfill her dream of funding her younger brother's future as a silversmith, leaving her with no choice but to surrender the property to pay off their mounting debts. Observing her quiet resolve, the young traveler acknowledged her practical plan, though the heavy burden on her shoulders was unmistakable. Continuing her explanation, the young woman recounted how an apprentice of her late father had delivered a message that very morning, claiming a buyer had already been found for the estate. Suspicion gnawed at her companion's mind as he silently questioned why so many people were exerting such immense pressure on her to relinquish everything so hastily. Guiding him toward the grand entrance, she warmly invited him inside, revealing that the entire ground floor had once operated as her father's thriving workshop alongside several spacious living quarters. Astounded by the sheer magnitude of the estate, he marveled at the impressive structure while quietly recognizing the profound heritage anchored to her family's name. Stepping through the heavy doorways, the pair crossed into a quiet, high-ceilinged hallway featuring an elegant wooden staircase that reached up toward the upper living quarters. Pausing to peer into an adjacent room, he beheld the cold hearths, heavy anvils, and stone masonry of the family's expansive forge, standing dormant yet steeped in history. As she began ascending the central staircase, he followed close behind, his gaze drifting upward as her footsteps echoed softly in the spacious home. At the top of the stairs, a small boy poked his head out from a doorway, prompting her to gently call out to him, urging the child to greet their visitor properly. Presenting her companion as their new bodyguard named Aiel, she was met with immediate candor from her little brother Pita, who bluntly blurted out how strange the name sounded, causing the sword master to merely raise an eyebrow in amused inquiry. Horrified by the boy's blunt breach of etiquette, she immediately chastised him for speaking ill of people's names and offered a swift apology, though her guest good-naturedly brushed off the minor offense with an easygoing smile. Kneeling down to meet the child at eye level, he offered a warm reassurance, explaining with a reassuring grin that being called weird simply meant one was far from ordinary, a description he had grown thoroughly accustomed to over the years. He teased the young boy, lightheartedly suggesting that being called weird by a cute girl might actually be a compliment rather than an insult, though Pita remained utterly baffled by his logic. In response, the boy suddenly remembered his father's stern vow to chase off any suitor who dared visit his sister, frantically asking if the traveler was actually her boyfriend, a notion he hastily and nervously denied. As the playful commotion settled, Shia approached with drinks, bringing a temporary calm to the living quarters as the three shared a brief moment together. Later that evening, the center of activity shifted to the local tavern, where townspeople gathered to unwind after a long day. Walking through the lively establishment, the young bodyguard exchanged polite greetings with the patrons, holding a mug while reminding himself that he needed to stay alert and refrain from drinking. Nearby, Shia bustled between tables with trays full of ale, her bright demeanor drawing quiet praise from customers who marveled at her strength following her father's passing. Suddenly, the striking exotic woman named Lim Lim leaned close to the young guardian, playfully chiding him for holding a drink while supposed to be actively protecting Shia. Correcting his clumsy attempt at her name, Lim Lim urged him with genuine concern to carry out his duty faithfully, but her teasing was abruptly cut short by the heavy, ominous sound of armored boots pounding outside. The cheerful ambience shattered as the trio turned in alarm toward the entrance, sensing an immediate presence looming just outside the door. Without a moment's hesitation, the young swordsman placed himself directly between the impending threat and the young girl, quietly instructing Shia to hide behind him. He stood firm as a giant. Bald Brute kicked open the door and burst into the tavern with a deafening roar. The intruder bellowed loudly, demanding to know the location of Ward's daughter as patrons watched in shock. His voice boomed across the crowded hall, fixing his sight on the terrified girl hidden behind the tables. The tavern fell into a tense silence as the surrounding men exchanged nervous glances, realizing trouble had arrived. Instead of taking the blow himself, the young swordsman shamelessly hoisted Lim Lim in front of him to use her as a human shield, leading to a furious shouting match between them as he insisted her sacrifice was necessary to secure Shia's safety. Hiker tried to intervene by suggesting she use her dancing skills as a distraction, but his comment about her age only offended her further, while little Shia desperately begged everyone to stop panicking. The chaotic bickering was abruptly cut short when a massive foot slammed onto the floorboards with overwhelming force. Serpent Hiliolic stepped forward, radiating a sinister, coercive aura akin to a venomous snake, coolly announcing that they merely wished to converse with the young girl. Sensing the immediate danger, the youth stepped between them and questioned Hiliolic directly, asking if he could clarify something about their intentions with the Badwan family. Hiliolic sinisterly explained the situation, revealing that the young lady's household was on the verge of being sold off to settle a debt, leaving the group startled by the grim revelation. He listened in stunned disbelief as the ruthless loan shark explained the cold reality of the situation, revealing that Shia's home had already been pledged to another lender to cover a debt involving rare dark green steel. Ignoring their protestations, the intimidating man gestured to his henchmen, dismissing any pleas of ignorance and ordering them to make everyone speak if they continued to play dumb. Surrounded inside the establishment, panic took hold among the young group as the thugs closed in, leaving them desperately looking for an escape route before violence erupted. Before the brute force could reach them, a mysterious red-haired traveler abruptly intervened, catching the young swordsman's attention in complete astonishment. The stranger crashed into the midst of the confrontation, sending the surprised aggressors tumbling back in sudden disarray. Standing firm between the victims and their tormentors, he declared that their exorbitant demands were entirely unreasonable, remaining undeterred even as the gang leader snapped back at him. The exchange of sharp words continued across the counter, with the burly leader mockingly countering the traveler's insults while the tension in the tavern reached a boiling point. Suddenly tossing his heavy cape directly over the leader's head to blind him, the stranger sparked immediate chaos as terrified onlookers fled the room, while the observant teenager identified the newcomer as a skilled wanderer from the Netherlands. Exploiting the distraction, he lunged straight into the group of attackers with incredible swiftness, moving fluently past their clumsy strikes. With a decisive, lightning-fast strike, he slammed one of the thugs to the floor, completely taking control of the battle. He stood composed after casually subduing the thugs, earning enamored stares from the dancer who marveled at his effortless bravery, while the young sword boy watched on in stunned disbelief. Shaken by the sudden turn of events, the hulking gang leader stuttered nervously as he realized his men were completely outmatched. Recognizing his defeat for the time being, the leader announced their retreat, demanding to know the mystery traveler's identity before departing. With an easy smile, the swordsman introduced himself as Hiker, assuring the thugs he had no intention of hiding if they ever wished to seek revenge. Having defused the danger, he prepared to take his leave, but the grateful dancer quickly approached to thank him for saving them. Blushing intensely, she overtly flirted with Hiker, eager to buy him a feast as a token of her appreciation, while the young boy looked on in utter bewilderment. Without waiting for an answer, she eagerly took charge, pulling him along while casually ignoring everyone else in her excitement. Left behind in the commotion, the youth expressed his utter disbelief at how easily the skilled warrior yielded to the woman's playful advances. When he tried to interject, the dancer aggressively pushed him away, warning him not to ruin her moment with her savior. As they all eventually settled down to share a meal together, the young boy quietly begrudged the traveler's charm, ultimately acknowledging that Hiker was a genuinely good person. He was undoubtedly a good-natured youth at heart, yet terribly naive for entangling himself in such dangerous affairs without a second thought. Observing his earnest nature, Hiker mused softly to Lim Lim about how foolish it was to confront vicious thugs without any backup, completely oblivious to how cruel the world could truly be. The next day arrived with an uneasy stillness, as if the light-hearted mood of the previous evening had been nothing more than a fleeting dream. Tragedy struck with brutal suddenness when local villagers gathered along the riverbank to drag a corpse from the water. It was Hiker, dead and floating downstream. As they walked together, Hiker suggested that a loan company might be behind the recent trouble, leaving Godfrey to puzzle over the connection. Inside the guard headquarters, Sykes mulled over a grim report regarding a corpse that had washed ashore along the riverbank the previous morning. Gathered inside the captain's office, the group debated their next move, with Hiker questioning whether they should make arrests given the overwhelming evidence linking Hill's faction to the crime. The captain dismissed the idea with cynical resignation, pointing out that without an official complainant, involved parties preferred to look the other way, leaving Hiker to bitterly comment on the world's rotten nature. He added that the body possessed a strange detail, a large tattoo carved onto its torso inscribed with a desperate plea to be buried in the soil, which they had honored by placing the remains in the town graveyard. Shifting the conversation towards daughter, Shia, the young swordsman inquired about her current plight, only to learn that her debt left her with almost no viable escape routes from Hill's group. Sykes pointedly remarked that fleeing forever was hardly a real solution, subtly prodding the youth while emphasizing the overwhelming pressure Xia faced under her massive financial burden. He then proposed a potential way out, noting that Ward possessed the secret dark green steel technique, suggesting that if they could recover and sell this valuable asset to the guild, Xia's massive debt could finally be settled. He stepped into the room, greeted by Xia's cheerful morning welcome as she expressed her gratitude once again for his assistance. He offered a simple, low-key response in return as he walked inside. Considering the obligation he had taken on, the young swordsman reminded himself that safeguarding her was now his formal duty. Turning his attention to the slumped dancer on the side, he questioned whether she had actually fulfilled her duty of watching over the girl throughout the night. Clutching her throbbing head in misery, the hungover woman groaned in agony, begging him to keep his voice down as her hangover battered her senses. She dramatically protested against staying sober for guard duty, insisting a drink was necessary, while Xia assured the exasperated young warrior that nothing inappropriate had transpired between them, prompting him to angrily defend his honor. Shifting the conversation, he inquired about her younger brother, and Xia explained that Pita had set off that morning to train under one of their late father's old friends, having firmly chosen to pursue the path of a blacksmith. Hearing of the young boy's resolve, he released a long, weary breath, causing Xia to look at him in mild confusion. Though reluctant to entangle himself further in dangerous affairs, he knew in his heart that he could not abandon the vulnerable siblings, recalling Sykes' proposal to clear their massive debt by uncovering Ward's legendary dark green steel forging technique. Resolving to take action, he turned back to Xia with a gentle request, asking if he might inspect her late father's forge. Stepping into the quiet workshop, Xia led him among the cold anvils and hearths, explaining how their father's apprentice Torque had searched everywhere for records of the dark green steel technique to no avail, leaving the remaining filing cabinets searched while the rest of the workspace remained exactly as her father left it. Examining the entryway floor, he noticed distinct scratches that had not been there during his previous visit. Moving further into the center of the spacious chamber, the girl pointed down at the barren stone floor, explaining with a solemn voice that her father had been found lying face down in that exact spot. As she crouched down in sorrow, recalling how her father was fatally stabbed from behind, he turned his eyes upward to analyze the room's layout. High near the ceiling sat 3 narrow slit windows, far too small for any intruder to fit through. Overcome by grief and feeling utterly lost after the tragedy, she confessed to having actively sought out the mysterious faction known as the Night Dwellers. Hearing this revelation, the swordsman stared back at her in silence as he processed the gravity of her actions. He quickly cautioned her against relying on such dangerous individuals, reminding her that rumors painted the Night Dwellers as ruthless assassins rather than merciful saviors. Xia softly acknowledged his point, realizing her mistake in desperate hope. Pondering the secretive group and their shadowy figures, he silently questioned whether the Night Dwellers possessed any sense of nobility at all, or if they were purely mercenary in their pursuits. A sudden screech broke his concentration as the dancer cried out in distress over getting soot smeared on her skin. Startled by the abrupt scream, both he and Xia turned around to address her outburst, while Xia scolded her companion for recklessly wandering near the filthy furnace area. A sudden realization struck him like a bolt of lightning, causing his eyes to widen in shock as he looked at the surroundings. Inquiring about her father's working habits, he asked if the late blacksmith had been an extraordinarily meticulous man. When Xia confirmed that her father was indeed a strict stickler for order, he looked over at the wall where every single tool sat impeccably arranged in pristine order. Examining the workshop closely, they observed that the tools were spotless, unlike a typical working smithy. The only dirty areas in the entire room were the ashes near the furnace and the debris from the broken door, pointing toward a deliberate anomaly. He listened closely as the stories of Ward's obsessively rigid routine were recounted, describing a man who put on his shoes in the exact same sequence every morning and flew into a rage whenever anything was moved out of place. As the conversation turned to the blacksmith's habits, it was revealed that while Ward worked alongside Torque for normal jobs, he insisted on total solitude whenever researching the elusive dark green steel. Suddenly, a peculiar detail caught his attention: the recollection that on the very day Ward died, He had inexplicably flustered himself enough to mix up his left and right shoes and kick them aside. He let out a weary sigh at the cascading mysteries, while the young girl expressed her gratitude and offered to clean the remaining tools in the workshop. Sitting amid the papers, he weighed the baffling facts. Ward was murdered inside an uninterable locked room. His property had been secretly mortgaged behind his back, an unremembered debt loomed, and all trace of his secret technique had vanished. While he continued reviewing the records, the dancer reclined lazily beside him, letting out a relaxed sigh as she stretched across the floor. Shocked by her abrupt shift in tone, she suddenly pointed an accusing finger at him and shouted, questioning who he was calling a pervert. Unfazed by her outburst, he leaned in dramatically close, his intense gaze locking onto hers without hesitation. He instructed her sternly that if any strangers were to arrive in his absence, she must never leave little Sia unattended with them under any circumstances. Taking his leave for the day, he bade farewell to Sia, reassured by a huff of agreement from the dancer that the warning had been taken to heart. He prepared to take his leave, mentioning that his sister would be upset if he ate out too often before returning home. Lim Lim lightly shooed him away, reminding him that she might be late the following day, while young Xia looked on quietly. Pausing at the doorway, the young swordsman conceded that such unpredictability was simply part of the work they did. As the door closed behind him, Lim Lim turned her attention toward Xia, remarking on the bond between the young warrior and his sister. She mused with a soft chuckle that having an unreliable older brother often forced the younger sister to become the responsible one. Observing Xia's polite demeanor, she noted how strictly the girl had clearly been brought up. Hearing those words, the girl looked back in quiet contemplation. Inspired by her stoic resolve, Lim Lim realized that she, too, needed to step up and become someone truly dependable for the children. Meanwhile, Godfrey walked into the suffocating gloom of the city's nightlife district. The oppressive air reeked of cheap booze, heavy makeup, and the sickening stench of desperate souls who had sold their own freedom for coin. Traversing the shadows, he found the pathetic, begging gazes of people ruined by their own vices deeply revolting, grating sharply against his nerves. He soon arrived before a grand, imposing establishment, where guarding thugs sneered and warned him that this was no place for penniless brats. Undeterred, he announced firmly that he had come to see Hilialik. Reluctantly calling inside, one of the guards relayed to the inner quarters that a youth from Bordwan's place was requesting an audience. The young warrior offered a brief word of thanks, keeping his focus razor-sharp. His eyes narrowed with quiet intensity, ready to confront whatever dangerous truth awaited him inside. He stood at the threshold of the opulent chamber, greeted by the crime boss's smooth, mocking voice acknowledging his bold entrance. Lounging comfortably amidst lavishly dressed women, Hilialik casually accused him of interfering in syndicate affairs during their previous encounter. A sly smirk spread across the crime lord's face as he waited for a response, thoroughly enjoying his position of absolute authority. Offering a casual grin, he deflected the accusation, explaining that his previous actions were merely to keep up appearances for his own employer. Pivoting the conversation away from his guard duty, he shifted the topic directly to the young orphan, Sia. Hilialik scoffed dismissively, claiming that pitted street kids were a dime a dozen in this city and hardly worth anyone's concern. While the crime boss warned him to stick strictly to his duties rather than getting wrapped up in endless local tragedies, the young warrior remained steadfast. Standing firmly before the syndicate leader, he delivered a sharp revelation, announcing that he had tracked down a lead on the murderer of Sia's father. The unexpected statement instantly caught Hilialik's attention, causing the underworld boss to lean forward with piqued curiosity. Locking eyes with the crime lord, he delivered his ultimate accusation, asking directly if Hilialik was connected to the killer. Inside the residence, time passed slowly as the women gathered, waiting for the young boy to return from his first day of apprenticeship. Their stomachs growled in unison, making them wonder if they should begin dinner without him. Before they could decide, a sudden heavy impact echoed from the doorway, announcing someone's return. Hearing the commotion, they rushed down the corridor together to investigate the sudden arrival. Reaching the entryway, Xia was alarmed to find her young brother, Pita, trembling and in tears beside a tall, powerfully built man named Torque. The gentle giant stood awkwardly as the weeping boy clung to his side, struggling to choke back his sobs. Between heavy sniffling, the boy explained the sudden ordeal, revealing that aggressive debt collectors had recklessly forced their way into the training grounds where his master was working. The unexpected intrusion had caused chaos, forcing Torque to accompany him back safely. Averting his gaze in embarrassment, Torque addressed Lim Lim directly, explaining that he had come personally to offer his formal apologies for the trouble that had unfolded. Though Lim Lim hesitated to leave him unattended, Shia softly stepped in and asked if she would guide young Pita into the living room, seeking a moment to speak with the giant alone. Looking up with quiet earnestness, she reassured him that she held complete faith in his character, willing to hear whatever he needed to share. Acceding to the request, the dancer beckoned young Pita to follow her inside, noting the deep sense of trust Shia placed in the man, even as she maintained a vigilant eye over the unfolding circumstances. As Torque brought troubling news regarding the mansion, pointing out that the debt collectors were already aware of the existing mortgage, Shia listened silently, her expression grim as the gravity of their financial plight sank in. He continued explaining the harsh reality of their situation, warning that if nothing changed, the young master would be cast out. He added reluctantly that her beauty meant she could easily clear the debt if sold into servitude, leaving her stunned as the terrifying implication hung in the air. The word echoed through her mind, filling her eyes with quiet horror. The thought of becoming a slave was a terrifying prospect she had never dreamed she would ever have to face. Beyond her own fate, the true danger lay in what the debt collectors would do if the burden persisted. If the debt dragged on, those ruthless men would not hesitate to seize both her and the young master, selling them both into bondage. Her heart sank at the horrific realization that even little Peter could be torn away and sold off like property. A vision flashed in her mind of her little brother, beaten, bruised, and weeping as he called out to her for help that she couldn't provide. The desperate whimpers of her helpless brother echoed relentlessly in her thoughts, demanding action. Refusing to let such a nightmare become reality, she steeled her resolve, knowing she had to be strong and dependable for Peter's sake. With intense fire igniting in her eyes, she declared with fierce determination that she would find a way to secure the money no matter what it took. Torque watched her in silence, stunned by the sudden, unshakable resolve burning in the young woman's gaze. While he was left standing stunned in the shop, elsewhere Godfrey directly confronted the mob boss Hilielek, demanding to know how the man was connected to the murder of Shia's father and asking him to explain his reasoning. Reluctantly, Hilielek admitted that ruthless Yakuza were pressuring Shia to collect her father's debts, while nearby, Hiker forcefully held down an associate to compel him to speak. Ordering his associate to stand down, Hilielek brushed off the accusation, asserting that his only concern was ensuring Shia remained unbothered by loan sharks rather than capturing the actual murderer. Taking charge of the room, the young swordsman outlined the 4 crises surrounding Shia, noting that while the secret method for crafting dark green steel was still missing, he had already deduced the answer to her father's impossible murder in a locked room. He displayed a breakdown of the sealed chamber, pointing out that despite the locked door and soul-high window convincing others of a supernatural death, the reality was far more straightforward. Reconstructing the blacksmith's daily routine, he explained how Shia's father was a man of strict habit who followed an unvarying schedule whenever materials were heating in the forge. Continuing his deduction, he described how the blacksmith would predictably lean against the exact same spot on the workshop wall during these waiting intervals to rest and smoke a cigarette. With a sharp, decisive look, he revealed that anyone aware of this precise habit could simply pierce a thin, lethal stake through a small opening in the exterior wall directly into his neck. The lethal method demanded intimate familiarity with the blacksmith's solitary work hours, pointing directly towards someone who shared his daily operations in the forge. Connecting the final piece of evidence, Godfrey triumphantly named the only suspect with full access and knowledge of the routine, Torque, the blacksmith's own apprentice. He laid out the remaining details, explaining how Torque had been ejected from the workshop on the day of the murder over a trivial excuse, placing him right in the garden where the wooden stake was driven. In response, the crime lord acknowledged that Torque appeared to be the prime suspect, though the fair-haired traveler noted that the young girl's troubles did not end with her father's passing. Continuing his argument, The traveler pointed out how the debt collectors had targeted her immediately afterward, a ruthless move the boss brushed off as mere routine business. Reclining comfortably, he countered that he had audited the blacksmith's financial books himself, finding every transaction impeccably recorded and no record of any outstanding loan whatsoever. Throwing his hands up dramatically, the young swordsman questioned how the family estate could have possibly been offered as collateral, inviting everyone to see through the blatant fraud. He synthesized the whole scheme. A bitter apprentice murders his strict master, conspires with loan sharks to invent a fake debt, forces a helpless girl into losing her home, and attempts to extract the invaluable secrets of dark green steel. Leaning forward with a playful grin, he mockingly asked if his theory sounded compelling enough. Unshaken by the accusation, the crime lord sat motionless beside his companions and demanded to know what the swordsman actually intended to gain from presenting all these facts. When the boss accused him of being a simple blackmailer, he readily agreed with a smirk, proposing that joining the scheme to squeeze profit out of the stubborn heiress seemed far too lucrative to ignore. To back up his proposition, he gestured toward the workshop documents laid out on the table before them. He calmly pressed the young noble on his sinister motives, calling out the plot to sell the girl into slavery over an unpaid debt. In response, the noble offered only a cold, menacing grin, making it clear that the only thing awaiting him was death. Before another word could be spoken, a cold steel blade was suddenly pressed against his throat from behind. Captured in a split second, he was marched through the narrow passageway under the strict control of his assailant. The thug taunted him while forcing him forward, chuckling at how swiftly they had moved to neutralize any potential threat. Yet despite the mortal danger resting against his neck, his expression remained eerie and completely unbothered. Meanwhile, inside a grand and secluded mansion, Naora stood nervously before two enigmatic figures draped in white robes. Speaking in low, measured tones, one of the hooded figures urged her to carefully reconsider her choices. Overwhelmed by fear, she wavered anxiously, prompting the figure to sternly remind her of the absolute power held in that room. Looking up with glossy, tear-stained eyes, she quietly offered her complete compliance. She listened in silence as the cloaked figure sitting before her reminded her of where she was, a slave trading house. Though she was known as Ms. Kurakara, a wealthy and prominent figure among Sanagan's elite, the figure coldly declared that speaking the truth aloud made her fate real. She was about to become a slave. In response to this stark declaration, the veiled master asked if she truly grasped the gravity of giving someone complete power over her life and death. Despite the chilling warning, she bowed her head slightly and affirmed that becoming a slave was precisely what she intended. As her heart hammered violently against her chest, her eyes welled with resolute tears. She told herself that she was fully prepared to throw her own life into darkness, willing to endure whatever horror lay ahead if it meant securing a future for her brother. The grim realities of her choice loomed terrifyingly before her. The threat of grueling manual labor, being bought by a depraved master, subjected to endless degradation, or even meeting a fate far more miserable than death itself. Breaking the dark silence, the buyer questioned if there was no one in her life who would be deeply saddened by her disappearance. With a quiet, heavy breath, she admitted that there were indeed people who would care. Clenching her hands tightly in her lap, her knuckles turned pale as she admitted that there were those who would weep for her, people whose memory gave her pause, yet could not turn her back on this sacrifice. A single tear glistened in her eye, capturing the overwhelming weight of her sorrow and absolute devotion. With her resolve laid bare, she uttered a final, quiet wish from the depths of her heart, praying only that her brother would find true happiness. Hearing her selfless declaration, the hooded buyer shifted, rising slightly as the quiet tension in the room reached its breaking point. Impressed by her unwavering conviction, the buyer slammed a gloved hand down and agreed to purchase her, calling out for an assistant named Silver Cat to immediately prepare the binding contract. She could only nod softly in bewildered acceptance as her fate was sealed. She stood frozen as the buyer leaned close, his piercing gaze reminding her that the contract lay right before them. He offered a stern, final warning, emphasizing that signing the document would strip away her humanity entirely, reducing her to a mere commodity, and reminded her that this was her last chance to turn back. As tears welled in her eyes, both parties solemnly swore under the Kurakara name, guaranteeing that the funds would reach her brother, but confirming the grim truth that her life as a human being was about to end. The dark terms were laid bare. Once signed, a collar of servitude would force complete obedience, leaving her powerless against any demand, no matter how humiliating or degrading. Even the ultimate command, to end her own life, would be absolute and unavoidable once the seal was affixed. Despite the terrifying consequences outlined before her, she offered her quiet thanks and reaffirmed that her mind was firmly made up. Deep within her heart, she reassured herself that she could endure whatever horrors lay ahead. Driven by the resolve to shield her brother from such a horrific destiny, she softly pleaded to be purchased, putting pen to paper and surrendering her very soul to. Early morning brought no rest, only the unwelcome disturbance of cawing crows gathering over a fresh corpse dumped in a side alley after a guard's dispute. Inspecting the body, it became clear that the victim was not a guard at all, but rather one of the local thugs, raising immediate questions as to how a frail child could have slain such a man. Returning to business, the old shopkeeper parted ways with his client, grinning broadly at the ideal timing of their deal while receiving final words of encouragement. Shortly after, the old man was startled to discover that one of the nearby graves had been disturbed and opened overnight, though he quickly dismissed it as none of his concern. Meanwhile, as they strolled down the street, the night dweller and his companion reflected on the previous night's events, discussing the reclaimed property funds and the unexpected betrayal of their associate. He added that while their rival would never abandon his pursuit of the dark steel formula, he had now lost any legitimate pretense to confront Shia directly. As they continued walking, their progress was interrupted by a sharp, authoritative voice calling out from behind, demanding to know why they were lingering. Turning around with an annoyed expression, the young man recognized Shia standing before them. Immediately rejecting the playful moniker she threw his way, she scolded the boy for making jokes during a crisis, but he shrugged it off, proposing they press the man who seized the mansion to retrieve their cash. Before he could elaborate, she cut him off in tears, revealing that Shia had suddenly gone missing. Shocked by the news, he grabbed her shoulders, demanding to know how she lost track of Shia when they slept in the same room. Calming down, he pondered yesterday's events, wondering if the visit from the blacksmith's apprentice was connected to her disappearance. As he voiced his deductions out loud, she stared back blankly, confessing she had not paid attention to a single word. Enraged by her apathy, he threw a frantic tantrum, screaming that her uselessness was why no man would ever marry her. Surprised by his fierce outburst, her posture softened as she offered a quiet apology. To smooth things over, she casually offered to compensate him with a kiss, leaving him completely flabbergasted. Yet beneath her playful deflection, her gaze darkened with intense worry over Shia's plight. Fleeing her bizarre apology, he rapidly calculated their deadline, realizing they had only until tomorrow morning to raise funds before Shia was auctioned off by slavers. He sprinted down the corridor, ignoring her calls to wait, knowing that halting now would render his sister's sacrifice meaningless. She called out his name as he bounded down the stairwell, acutely aware of the grave situation unfolding. Dread hung heavy between them as both acknowledged the dire reality they now faced. Panting heavily, the boy bolted through the thick foliage outside, driven by pure urgency. Pushing past exhaustion, he stumbled through the brush toward the location of the hidden money. Kneeling on the ground, he tightly clutched the pouch, the payment left behind for his sister's sale. He recalled the strange man who had tossed the heavy pouch onto his chest, rudely waking him. The visitor had stated the gold was payment from his boss before abruptly departing. Returning to the present, he rushed over to Uncle Torgu, breathlessly recounting the strange encounter. Holding up the coin bag, he declared his unshakable resolve to use the funds to buy his sister back. He clutched the money tightly, tears streaming down his face as the brute mockingly declared that his sister would soon belong to him and that the boy was no longer needed. Refusing to yield, the boy bolted toward a narrow gap in the alleyway, yelling back that he would never hand over his sister while the thug bellowed for him to halt. Realizing the massive man was far too large to squeeze through the tight opening, he squeezed inside, cursing his attacker and vows of vengeance echoing in his mind. Desperate for freedom, he dragged his small frame through the cramped stone passage as fast as his arms could pull him. Suddenly, a blade flashed in the shadows behind him with brutal intent. A sharp steel blade plunged into his back, eliciting an agonizing scream that echoed through the narrow tunnel while his assailant laughed maliciously. With ruthless cruelty, the attacker struck again through the gap, leaving the young boy collapsed on the cold ground in a pool of his own blood. Mocking the boy's struggle, the heavy footsteps of the brute receded as he boasted he would simply circle around from the other side to finish the job. Ignoring the searing pain in his wounded back, he forced himself up and began crawling away, fueled only by the grim determination to put distance between himself and his pursuer. Leaving a streak of blood along the stone wall, he stumbled forward down the empty alley, his vision blurring as heavy fatigue began to claim his consciousness. He slowly opened his eyes, realizing he had drifted off amid haunting memories of a distant birthday. Lying gravely wounded in the alley, his strength ebbed as despairing thoughts of death took hold, prompting a faint cry for his sister. Glancing upward, his failing gaze caught sight of a crimson curtain and a dark blade hanging above. Remembering the city's dark legend, he recalled that speaking the secret phrase beneath that emblem would summon deadly judges. Uttering the requested chant to save his sister, an eerie phantom voice answered, accepting his desperate bid. The masked assassin confirmed the harsh terms, asking if the boy truly desired the complete annihilation of his sister's captors. Striking the dark bargain, the figure warned that such absolute retribution came with a heavy cost. Relief washing over him, the young boy finally succumbed to his exhaustion and slipped into unconsciousness. As his breathing faded into silence, the gears of a deadly fate were set permanently, and frustrated as the sun began to set, the young swordsman wandered through the narrow city alleyways, searching endlessly for Beta. It had been quite some time since he had parted ways with his companion to search separate sections of the district, yet he had found no trace of the missing boy. He reached a dead end in the shadowy alley, contemplating whether he should abandon the search for the evening and return to the mansion. Before he could make his decision, a figure draped in a dark cloak materialized in the shadows ahead. Recognizing the stranger's likeness to Red Cat, the boy froze as the mysterious operative quietly instructed him to follow. They walked together through the cobblestone streets until they arrived before an imposing building known as Kurika Ra's trading house. Realizing where they were, the young warrior voiced his suspicion, suspecting the identity of his silent guide all along. Puzzled by the sudden change, the boy questioned the arrangement, but the masked handler promptly declined to elaborate, stating he had other pressing matters to settle and instructing him to pass the assignment along while directing him to a client waiting in the rear alley. As they descended a secluded staircase into the dark lower pathway, the young swordsman suddenly caught sight of something unexpected waiting for him in the shadows below. As he gazed down the narrow stone passage, the tragic reality settled heavily upon him. Young Beta had drawn his final breath after desperately seeking the night dwellers' aid to protect his sister. He turned to the hooded assassin for confirmation, only to hear the grim news that the boy himself was the client who had begged for protection against those threatening his family. Overcome with sorrow, he questioned if there was any way they could have saved the child, but the handler coldly explained that Kurikara's sprawling slave ring and the dark forces involved made Beta's demise inevitable. He lowered his head in silence, quietly processing the tragic outcome. Breaking the heavy quiet, the hooded figure laid out the specifics of the new contract, revealing that Silver Cat had monitored the city closely and identified two primary targets, Torque and Hillruck. Pondering the web of deceit surrounding the targets, he asked if the secondary assassin assigned to the hit was one of the notorious twins, though the handler quickly dismissed the idea. Before any further explanation could be given, a sharp click echoed through the alley as an unexpected figure stepped out from the shadows. He gasped in shock, eyes widening in disbelief as he recognized the high-heeled footwear and ornate hem of the person approaching them. Emerging fully into view, Shia stood tall in her elaborate dress, looking down with calm composure. Stunned by her sudden arrival, the young swordsman confronted her about hiding her life as an assassin, to which she coolly replied that he had kept the exact same secret from her. Her dramatic revelation was met with nothing more than an unamused, deadpan stare from her young companion. He remained silent as she maintained a cool, knowing gaze, entirely unbothered by his lack of enthusiasm. She suddenly struck a lively, cheerful pose, enthusiastically introducing herself as Rinrin, a fun-loving dancer who secretly served the shadowy assassin network known as the Night Dwellers. The young swordsman could only sweat drop at the absurd performance, silently musing that no real operative would ever blurt out their cover so recklessly. As they strolled together through the sunlit town streets, he grumbled about her secrecy, muttering that she could have given him a proper heads-up about her true identity. She calmly replied that as fellow operatives in broad daylight, it was best not to act overly friendly or draw attention to their connection. Her footsteps faltered as her eyes caught sight of a tragic spectacle in the alley. A lifeless, unarmed child lay abandoned on the cold ground, drawing a quiet sigh of pity from her lips. She crouched down beside the young victim, mourning the sheer cruelty of a world that preyed upon the weak and weaponless, questioning why the heavens permitted such injustice. Behind her, the young swordsman paused and glanced back, silently observing her grief. His expression hardened into a severe glare as her words echoed in his head, sparking a sharp realization regarding the true nature of their assignment. He pieced together the chaotic puzzle in his mind, analyzing Hilruk's relentless pursuit of the highly valuable formula and questioning why Shia had been directly involved from the very beginning. His thoughts churned over what Hilruk stood to gain from this scheme, realizing that regardless of how dark or dead his own eyes had become, the truth behind this conspiracy was far more foul than a simple contract. He watched as a slender hand casually twirled a delicate pipe through the shadows. Beneath the surface of the town's quiet routine, the shadowy mastermind orchestrating every single event remained hidden in plain sight. In the dim moonlight, whispers spread through the alleys as the order was given to summon the formidable A-rank assassin known as the Undying King. High above the rooftops, a tense silence settled over the city, signaling the dawn of a dark new chapter. Emerging from the gloom, the cloaked figure declared that their moment to take control of the night had finally arrived. Standing calmly before him was Shia, revealing her dual reputation as both the B-rank assassin Last Kiss and the dreaded S-rank killer known as Worst. Hearing this, the young swordsman stood frozen as the creed of the Night Dwellers echoed in his mind, that their sworn duty was to send those marked for death across the final boundary. As she brought the long pipe to her lips and took a slow breath, he found it nearly impossible to reconcile her playful demeanor with the ruthless reputation of the legendary assassin. Remarking on how looks could be deceiving, he questioned her motives for taking on such dangerous contracts, wondering why someone with her feared status was hoarding so much wealth. Staring down at a single coin in his palm, the swordsman quietly reflected that money was nothing more than a boundary line separating one life from the next. He stared down at the ground between them, dividing the dirt with an imaginary line to signify the boundary between those who survive and those who perish, declaring that gold coins serve only to mark that absolute divide. She exhaled a quiet puff of smoke, taking in his solemn declaration and reflecting on how simply he defined the boundary between living and dying. Observing his quiet intensity, she found herself amused by how absurdly serious he was deep down, carrying a heavy weight like sediment settled at the bottom of a life, yet finding that earnestness strangely endearing. Breaking the brief silence, she called out to him directly, catching his attention as he turned back to meet her gaze. She raised her open palm toward him, challenging his rigid view by asking him to define exactly where a single finger begins and ends, pointing out that even something as basic as the base of a digit is impossible to pinpoint without arbitrary definitions. Continuing her explanation, she pointed out how the transition from finger to palm and palm to arm is fundamentally fluid and vague, explaining that people naturally crave sharp boundaries because life itself is layered in unexamined ambiguity. She quietly admitted that her role in this world was simply to assist with those blurred lines, walking side by side with him through the narrow alleyway. As they continued forward, she reflected privately on the legendary assassin known as Worst, marveling at how someone so fiercely deadly in contract work could possess such a delicate, overly sensitive nature in his personal philosophy. He dismissed her deep philosophical speech with a careless shrug, claiming he understood her point about money, which prompted her to suddenly lean in close and startle him completely. With a beaming, mischievous grin, she offered to personally teach him how to spend his hard-earned money on worthwhile pleasures, though he immediately rejected her offer with an annoyed groan. She leaned in closely, eagerly trying to persuade him not to dismiss her offer so quickly, teasing him as a pure-hearted boy. When he protested the title in frustration, she insisted that an extraordinary deal had come up, one he simply couldn't afford to miss. A heavy silence settled between them as he stared back with a completely blank, unimpressed expression, while she remained snuggled right against his shoulder. Breaking the quiet standoff, she gave him a steady, meaningful gaze, prompting him to finally sigh in defeat and demand to know what this mysterious deal was supposed to be. Her words summoned the memory of a delicate girl bound in heavy chains and locked away as a slave. A girl named Shia, awaiting a hand that might reach out to save her before time ran out. Standing in the grand hall, the elegant woman questioned the young boy about failing to save their target. She confessed that she had always viewed him as a ruthless Grim Reaper, yet his recent hesitation suggested there was more to him. Unfazed by her critique, he simply wondered what their next course of action should be. She admitted that she would have to adjust her perception of him from now on. Interrupting their exchange, the masked assassin stepped forward to report their return. The boy immediately redirected his attention, asking for news regarding the formidable Undying King. The stealthy operative explained that the immortal commander was entirely dependable, assuring them he would drive all enemy forces past the boundary line before the night reached its end. Outside, heavy steel footsteps thundered across the stone pavement as a massive figure encased in armored plating marched through the estate, drawing bewildered stares from onlookers. Meanwhile, in a private chamber, the young swordsman reported to his commander that Torque was nowhere to be found, nor was there any sign of the coveted dark steel formula. Listening nearby, the boy seethed in silent rage, cursing the fugitive who had sold off the family mansion and ruined his reputation before vanishing. Moments later, a harrowing shriek pierced the quiet corridors, throwing the inner guards into immediate panic as they scrambled to determine if the complex was coming under attack. In the adjacent passage, the muscular brute turned toward the sudden uproar just as a heavy clattering strike shattered the structural entryway. He barely had time to comprehend the danger before a brutal, unseen blow severed a guard's throat, sending blood spraying through the air alongside an agonizing shriek. As panic erupted, another defender was slashed down in an instant, collapsing in a heap as screams echoed through the hallway. Inside the room, the men watched in horror as bloody mist painted the entryway, and another companion fell lifeless upon the cold floor. Stepping through the shattered entrance over the freshly slain bodies, a colossal knight clad in dark, heavy plate armor stood silent and imposing, leaving the survivors breathless with shock. Confronted by this formidable assailant, Nocturnal stepped forward with dark intent, demanding to know the identity of the giant who dared breach their domain. As the intruder spoke, a chilling voice resonated through the room, explaining that while there was no personal malice involved, his assigned duty was simply to push everyone present straight into the afterlife. While the threat loomed, memories resurfaced regarding the legend of the Undying King, pondering whether his supposed immortality was genuine or if there was a mortal reality behind his supernatural reputation. The men exchanged desperate whispers, attempting to rationalize what made this mythical warrior different from an ordinary human. The terrifying truth unveiled itself as the knight slowly raised his steel visor, revealing the unblemished, handsome face of the Undying King, unmistakably alive once more. Panic seized Nocturnal as he recalled stabbing the man relentlessly until death was absolute, leaving the group desperately scrambling for rationalizations like twins, magic, or disguise to deny the miraculous resurrection standing right before them. He panted in disbelief, staring across the dim room as the terrifying truth settled in. The legendary guild was facing an insurmountable threat. Ignoring the danger, the brute thugs surged forward, rallying each other with shouts that there was only one enemy, and that they could send this armored intruder straight back to his grave. A heavily built warrior leaped high into the air and brought his weapon smashing down, but the giant immortal didn't even bother to dodge. Having lost the luxury of rest to an ancient curse, physical blows meant nothing to him. Over endless centuries of relentless existence, even the behemoth himself had lost track of time, having lived as both a humble slave and a mighty ruler of the legendary nation of Highland that once governed these lands. Sweat poured down the leader's pale face as he watched the unstoppable force march toward them, paralyzed by the sheer nightmare unfolding before his eyes. In his former life, the tyrant had usurped the throne from his own father, invaded neighboring realms, and ultimately brought about his own ruin, earning the notorious title of Hydra the Usurper, a foolish king cursed with eternal life. Agonized screams echoed throughout the chamber as the Titan systematically dismantled his foes, knowing that no matter how long a fight lasted, he would always emerge as the killer in the end. Standing victorious over the defeated leader, the dark-armored behemoth ominously warned that the night of judgment was still far from over. Across the city, ominous rumors began to circulate through the narrow streets, carried by hushed conversations about the sudden demise of a notorious figure. The gruesome details were far worse than anyone imagined, as onlookers whispered about the massacre that had claimed Hilruck, his entire inner circle, and all his associates overnight. Inside a crowded tavern, patrons recoiled from the terrifying news, silencing anyone who dared utter the killer's name, while the broad-shouldered brute sat alone in stunned disbelief. He quickly realized that Hilruck's sudden death meant he was no longer bound to surrender the Darksteel formula or his hard-earned coin, yet bitter frustration gnawed at him over losing Shia. In a fit of fury, he slammed his heavy hand onto the table, raging aloud about how someone else had bought Shia from the slave trader before he could claim her. His sudden outburst was abruptly cut short when a sharp jab from behind struck his shoulder, causing him to wince in pain and spin around angrily. Turning around, he was met with the striking sight of a gorgeous young woman, standing poised and elegant amidst the dirty, crowded tavern. He stammered in shock at her presence, but she remained perfectly composed, offering a calm greeting and recalling their previous meeting. Leaning down close to his face, she inquired with a shadowy glance whether he knew where Shia had gone, leaving the trembling brute completely intimidated. She leaned tantalizingly close to the hulking brute, her quiet voice humming with unexpected warmth as she declared that he was completely her type. Brushing her cheek softly against his ear, her sudden intimacy caught him entirely off guard, his breath hitching as her delicate fragrance overwhelmed his senses. Trembling violently under her sudden advance, he slumped back in his seat, panting for air while the surrounding tavern patrons looked on in silent bewilderment. He stammered out a weak question, utterly baffled by her actions as she stood before him, casually holding a bottle of wine. Leaning over the table with a playful smile, she suggested they share a drink together to get acquainted, asking what he truly thought of her. Inwardly, his mind reeled in utter confusion. When he had seen her at the mansion before, he had written her off as vulgar and uninterested, making this sudden kiss and affection make no sense at all. Cooing softly, she hinted that perhaps they could find something fun to do afterward. The muscular brute felt his heart leap, a foolish grin creeping onto his face as he began to convince himself that he genuinely was her preferred kind of man. She then teased him about his obsession with Shia, feigning jealousy with a pout. Hearing that name sent his thoughts spiraling backward, dredging up memories of the very first time he had laid eyes on the real Shia, when she was merely 9 years old. He vividly recalled wandering through the filthy city street when a chance glimpse of the young girl halted him in his tracks. In a place so devoid of grace, the sheer beauty of that child struck him like a physical blow, awakening an immediate, primal desire to possess her. Driven by that fixation, he had taken a position as a lowly apprentice under her father, enduring relentless scolding and harsh labor. He had convinced himself that by proving his worth as a true craftsman, he would inevitably inherit the workshop and take Shia as his bride. Yet all his patient waiting had been crushed when the master sternly announced his true intentions. The master declared that young Beta would inherit the entire workshop along with the secret Darksteel formula, while Shia would be married off to a noble family, leaving the brute filled with bitter, murderous rage. He bellowed in sudden, violent fury, accusing her of outright deception as his rage boiled over. Clasping his chest as a sudden tightness made it difficult to breathe, He blamed his rising anger and the alcohol for his distress, while she feigned gentle concern and led him outside into the night air. As they moved down the quiet alley, he stumbled forward with labored breaths, nursing a bitter hatred for the blacksmith and the young boy who had taken everything from him. Dark fantasies consumed his mind, convincing him that by rights, she should already be his slave, entirely subject to his every cruel whim. Though his body grew heavier with each passing step, he vowed internally that he would never surrender his desire and would claim her one day, entirely unaware of her watchful eyes behind him. Without warning, a sudden violently convulsive spasm racked his torso, forcing him to his knees as he vomited uncontrollably onto the cobblestones while she shrieked in apparent horror. Raising his trembling hand to inspect the dark, sticky fluid dripping from his mouth, a wave of sheer terror washed over him as he realized it was blood. Panic overtook him as he coughed violently, dark blood spewing from his jaws while she watched in cold, silent detachment. Desperate to survive, he crawled toward her heels, pleading with what little strength he had left for her to fetch a doctor. Looking down upon his writhing form, she chuckled softly with dark amusement, informing him coldly that seeking medical help would be entirely pointless. She looked on without a trace of pity as the dying brute glared up at her, choking back a wave of dark blood as he snarled out his hatred. His furious demands for answers only drew a soft, mocking response from her silhouette. She teasingly questioned if he had already forgotten the kiss they shared. Sudden paralysis seized his body, making his legs go completely numb before he crashed heavily onto the damp cobblestones. Bleeding onto the dirty ground, he gasped in sheer agony, completely helpless against the deadly venom coursing through his veins. Terrified by her cold composure, he managed to choke out a desperate question, demanding to know what kind of monster stood before him. Looking down at his shuddering form, she casually brought up the night dwellers, offering to soothe his dying moments with an ancient tale. She began weaving the tragic legend of a nobleman's heir who fell in love with a humble maid, sparking a jealous fiancé to lay a cruel curse upon the pregnant servant. Unaware of the wicked spell, the maid brought forth a beautiful baby girl with deep brown skin and striking blue eyes, lovingly kissing her newborn child. Yet the curse transformed every drop of the child's body fluids into lethal poison, saliva that killed slowly, blood that struck instantly, and anyone who dared to love or unite with that child was doomed to perish. For the envy of the fiancé had ultimately stolen her ability to give or receive affection. She recalled how that cursed child, forbidden from ever knowing affection, had been kept hidden away in a secluded room of the mansion until the noble house ultimately collapsed into ruin. Behind her, the agonizing toxin fully took hold, silently corroding the brute's flesh as his lifeless body crumbled into the shadows. Wiping a stray tear as she adjusted her hair, she remarked softly that men who quietly listened to a woman were far more charming, though those who failed to listen to the end never gained much favor. Turning her gaze toward the dark alley, she noted that only one target remained. Meanwhile, in another corner of the city, guards gathered over another unnerving crime scene. They muttered among themselves about the relentless wave of bizarre deaths following the gruesome end of Miltus's men, wondering if a sinister curse was at work behind the gruesome corpses. Suddenly, Kurihara sprinted into the alleyway completely out of breath, calling out frantically to his leader, who chastised him for exhausting himself over mere running. Gasping for air, the young warrior triumphantly thrust a parchment forward, announcing that they had successfully uncovered the Darksteel formula, leaving his commander speechless in utter shock. Stepping quietly into the dimly lit corridor, Rinrin opened the heavy door into the room where the captive was held. Upon entering, she called out softly to Shia, who was sitting silently on the floor in her delicate white gown, trembling from the ordeal. Kneeling down beside her, the dark-haired woman placed a pouch of coins on the floor, explaining that the money belonged to Shia now that her freedom had been secured. Looking down with deep empathy, she reassured the girl that Aiel was the one who had bought her back from captivity, urging her that it was time to leave this grand estate and go home. As they prepared to leave, the traumatized sister spoke up in a weak, trembling voice to ask if her younger brother Beta was safe, raising immediate concern that debt collectors might threaten him if he was home alone. her eyes filled with tears at the mention of his name, unable to hide the crushing grief over what had happened to him. Overwhelmed by sorrow, she collapsed into her savior's arms, weeping uncontrollably as the painful truth overwhelmed her. Holding the heartbroken sister close, the older woman offered a comforting embrace, knowing that despite the tragic loss of her little brother, Shia had to find a way to carry on living. She sat brooding over the piling debts, staring intently at the bags of coin left on the table. The fraudulent loan taken by Torque had accrued exorbitant interest, making it impossible to pay off even if they raised the principal amount, leaving their home as guaranteed collateral to be forfeited. Contemplating their dire financial straits, her gaze drifted to the cold metallic slave collar locked around Shia's neck. The restrictive band served as a stark, painful reminder of the legal chains binding the young girl. She reflected on the harsh laws governing bondage, knowing that slaves bound by magical instruments were legally forbidden from simply being granted unconditional freedom. Proper legal repurchase procedures had to be fulfilled, leaving Shia's chances of becoming a free citizen exceptionally slim. As she offered comforting words, a sudden commotion outside shattered the quiet moment. Glancing toward the window, her breath caught as an unexpected figure made a surprising appearance. Driven by sudden alarm, she bolted out the doorway to investigate, questioning what reckless plot was unfolding right outside her threshold. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, the spiky-haired young swordsman led the muscular guard captain through the narrow back streets, promising that inspecting the crime scene firsthand would explain everything. Stepping into the dark, abandoned workshop, the youth began breaking down the exact sequence of events that led to the master blacksmith's murder. Continuing his breakdown, he pointed out that Torque's previous testimony was a complete lie, revealing that Hilruck had actually died trapped inside a sealed room rather than an open alleyway. To prove his point, he gestured directly at a tiny, plastered-over hole in the wall, explaining that the lethal strike had been delivered from outside through this narrow aperture. As the captain absorbed the evidence, the young swordsman exposed Torque's full scheme, explaining how the traitor murdered his master, fruitlessly searched the place for the coveted Darksteel formula, and then fabricated debts using the house as collateral to corner the master's daughter. He continued probing the guard captain, questioning why Hilruck had been so fixated on acquiring the Darksteel formula in the first place, suspecting it was purely for financial gain. Resting his chin on his hand, he recalled how Hilruck had specifically instructed Shia to sell the formula to the guild. He admitted that selling it to the blacksmith's guild seemed logical on the surface, as they would pay a fair price, but the transaction still felt inherently unnatural. Outside their borders, all the neighboring nations were currently locked in brutal warfare, creating an unprecedented demand for advanced weaponry. Gesturing animatedly, he argued that a ruthless man like Hilruck could have pitted warring nations against each other to command an astronomical price, making his directive to sell locally look like absurd charity. The captain watched him closely from behind, cautioning that while youth often breeds cynicism, he was taking his suspicions too far. Turning with sudden fury, the commander roared, demanding whether the youth possessed any pride as a guard, though he merely scoffed in response. With a sharp smirk, he maintained that beneath noble ideals lay only raw human greed, asserting that an unseen force must have pushed Hilruck into making such an illogical choice. Processing the sharp deduction, the captain asked if this meant an unknown mastermind was pulling Hilruck's strings from behind the scenes. He nodded in agreement, warning that whatever this mysterious figure offered in return, it was something far more dangerous than simple gold. He continued laying out his reasoning, pointing out that only someone with full knowledge of Darksteel, a clear incentive to arm the guild, and the authority to present such an offer could have orchestrated the arrangement with Hilruck. Recalling past encounters, he brought up how someone had personally intervened with Hilruck, pleading on another's behalf and using their sway to ensure the transaction proceeded. The heavy implication left the captain stunned into silence as his subordinate called out to him, awaiting his command. His stern features hardened as the uncomfortable truth settled in, exposing a betrayal rooted deep within his own circle. Pressing the advantage, the young warrior reminded the captain of the impending peril, warning that if war breached their borders, his guards would be sent directly to the front lines to die first. Though the captain attempted to rationalize the trade as a necessary sacrifice to save lives in combat, the young swordsman immediately rejected the hollow excuse. Stripping away the noble facade, he forced the commander to face his true weakness, that his actions were driven by a coward's desire to avoid witnessing his men fall, hearing their families weep, and shouldering the guilt. Outside the dimly lit corridor, tension crackled as the reality of human hypocrisy became impossible to deny. Clenching his fist, the youth declared that he would never turn a blind eye nor forgive those whose schemes had led to Beta's demise and Shia's tears. Surrounded by racks of weapons, the two men stood facing one another in a quiet standoff, the air thick with unspoken resolve. He stood in heavy silence as the guard captain scoffed at his resolve, reminding him that ever since his foster father Gasper died, he had treated him like family by forcing him into the guard corps to earn his keep. Challenging the youth's defiance, the commander demanded to know if he truly intended to raise his blade against the very man who had raised him. Unmoved by the emotional appeal, the boy calmly replied that the captain had already crossed a line from which there was no return. Glancing back into his past, he confessed a dark truth. He had been the one to take Gasper's life, marking this pending clash as the third time he would kill a parental figure, having long forgotten his birth parents. Enraged by the claim, the captain laughed mockingly, insisting that Gasper was an elite warrior whom no weakling could ever defeat, dismissing the boy as a talentless coward incapable of taking a life. Drawing his broadsword with a harsh scrape of steel, the commander swore to punish him for slandering Gasper's memory, intent on beating obedience back into him by blade. In a quiet memory from their training days, two young apprentices discussed the shadowy rumors surrounding the mysterious night dwellers, debating whether dark magic or ancient curses were responsible for their lethal reputation, even as one scoffed at the idea of magic surviving into the present era. Returning to the present clash, the furious guard captain swung his heavy sword, taunting his young opponent and swearing to beat sense back into him just like in their past sparring sessions. Instead of defending himself, the spiky-haired warrior stood completely motionless before the descending blade, alarming the commander, who could not fathom why his former subordinate made no attempt to dodge. He suddenly darted forward with unsettling swiftness, confusing the veteran who initially doubted the boy possessed the skill or courage to launch a trap, yet sensed a sudden wave of impending danger. The imposing captain's confidence disintegrated as a terrifying realization struck him. The youth before him was no mere failure of a guard, but a true member of the feared organization known as the Night Dwellers. With a cold, sinister chuckle breaking into dark laughter, the young assassin revealed his true identity, declaring that one of the kingdom's most dangerous killers was standing right before him. He greeted in response. The dark assassin looked down at the warrior with cold contempt, dismissing his desperate excuses as pathetic babble lacking any real conviction. Narrowing his gaze, he warned the fallen captain not to diminish the worth of his own impending death. Silhouetted against the light, the defeated captain quietly accepted the reality that the boy remained unwavering in his intent to kill. Watching the confrontation unfold, the young woman recoiled in shock as she processed the horrifying truth that he was prepared to murder the very man who had raised him as a father. Casting her eyes downward, she could barely comprehend the dark torment driving someone to commit such a tragic act. She reflected on the tragic nature of their kind, knowing every assassin carried a curse where power came only at the cost of losing what was most precious. Memories surfaced of her own painful past, recalling how she had listened behind closed doors to her own father tearfully begging for forgiveness. Remembering the crushing grief of learning her father had died, she struggled to understand how anyone could willingly sever such a bond. Nearby, the quiet boy observed the heavy moment in total silence, his eyes carrying a profound, somber weight. He sat in quiet contemplation as Rinrin observed him, finally understanding why the light in his eyes had grown so dull and lifeless over time. Nearby, Shia wept softly into her knees, overwhelmed by the realization that the young swordsman's life had been utterly consumed by malice and tragedy. Reflecting on his tragic burden of having to kill 3 separate father figures, she resolved within herself that someone needed to teach him true kindness and goodwill. Watching the emotional display, Rinrin sensed danger, realizing that Xia was clinging to someone even more broken than herself just to guard her fragile heart. Attempting to gently interject, the elder assassin tried to guide her attention toward Beta as well. Dismissing the caution, Xia insisted that he was simply a precious younger brother who had once been misdirected but possessed a good heart when properly taught. With gentle compassion in her eyes, she concluded that he, too, was nothing more than a child desperately starved for love. Suddenly, an abrupt noise shattered the solemn atmosphere, startling everyone present in the room. A heavy wooden hatch swung violently open, signaling a decisive shift in events from which there would be no turning back. Men stood near a bloody scene above, callously discussing framing a death in the line of duty while arranging practical matters for the survivors. He dragged his dark steel weapon across the cracked earth, sparks flying from the edge as tension filled the air. Promising a swift end to spare the child any unnecessary agony, he readied his attack, though the young boy faced him with an eerie, unfazed coldness. A strange green luminescence radiated along the weapon's edge, signaling the dark steel's incredible durability, a metal twice as hard as common steel, capable of retaining its razor-sharp rim through endless battle. Driven mad by the loss of his fallen men, he lunged forward with a furious roar, swinging the legendary sword downward while his subordinates cried out in warning. In his mind, he offered a quiet apology to his fallen comrade, confident that his decisive blow was about to settle the score once and for all. Yet in that split second, a sudden, blinding shift in movement disrupted his rhythm, sharp eyes tracking his incoming strike without the slightest hint of fear. Before his blade could complete its path, a counterstrike cut through the air, slicing past his defense so fast it defied human sight. A single gust of wind swept across the stone as the phantom attack completed its deadly trajectory. Staggering backward, he stared down in total bewilderment as blood showered onto the stone floor, his knees giving out beneath him. Bleeding heavily, he struggled to comprehend how he had been sliced open when his opponent had not moved an inch or even braced for impact, only for the young boy to calmly look down at him and offer a final lesson about the curse resting upon his shoulders. He began to explain the reality of his curse, defining it as the manipulation of cause and effect where any deadly force directed at him is inverted completely. As he outlined the power, the fatal moment where the captain intended to strike him down was systematically altered by the universe. Slumping forward in bloody disbelief, the dying guard captain gasped, realizing too late that the terrifying rumors surrounding the boy were genuine. Reversing the fate of the encounter, the reality of the blow was rewritten so that the attacker fell instead, ending the fight instantly. With his foe collapsing lifeless onto the ground, the young warrior looked down at his blood-stained arm with a cold, hollow expression. Letting out a weary breath in the quiet room, he observed the motionless body, acknowledging that the immediate threat was finally over. Binding his hair neatly behind his neck, he quickly calculated his next move, resolving to play the part of a terrified survivor fleeing to report the captain's murder. Pausing for a moment in the silence, a sudden hesitation crept into his thoughts as he reflected on the final moments of the attack. Recalling the exact second the blow was struck, he remembered how the captain's initial lethal intent had subtly shifted right after their eyes locked. Lowering his eyes once more, he pondered the true nature of that final glance, questioning what the captain had really intended in his last breath. He stood quietly as the captain's lifeless body hit the floor, blood spreading across the cracked ground from the sword embedded in his skull. Surveying the scene, the elegant woman noted that the confrontation had finally come to an end, a sentiment the young boy softly echoed with a weary nod. She clarified that they hadn't been spying on him, warning that revealing the mechanics of his ability was dangerous, as enemies could plan counters. The boy nonchalantly replied that it didn't bother him, convinced that knowing the truth changed nothing about his burden. Bringing up the fallen leader, she expressed surprise at his calm demeanor, pointing out that the man had been like a father to him and questioning why he wasn't far more distraught. Shocked by his sudden, grotesque facial expression, she recoiled in alarm, scolding him for making a face that didn't suit him at all. Composing himself, the boy reflected that while the boss had indeed been family to him, he had long since given up on relying on such bonds, knowing how easily they shattered. Looking upon the corpse, The woman pondered the horrific reality of his existence, realizing that his curse forced him into a cycle where his own loved ones would attempt to murder him, only to die by their own hands instead. His curse was a relentless torment that condemned him to endless isolation, earning him the grim moniker of the worst illness, a destiny of inescapable solitude. Standing inside the stone corridor, Nishina quietly confessed the grim reality of her past. Recalling the terrifying moment, she realized that everyone around her was actively trying to take her life. Listening intently, the young boy softly agreed, acknowledging that his own father had treated him with the exact same cold brutality. Looking down at him, she was struck by the realization that he was burdened with a tragically isolated existence, condemned to endure a lonely destiny far heavier than anyone his age should bear. Her dark eyes suddenly widened as an unexpected and revolutionary thought took root in her mind. She recalled the precise nature of his unique power, remembering that his absolute ability reflected any attack directed at him back toward the aggressor, completely reversing any harmful force used against his life. Connecting the dots, she reasoned that if his reflection held true for physical force, it meant his power could potentially reflect deadly poison as well. With her heart pounding furiously against her chest, the full magnitude of the truth hit her. If her own deadly poison was bounced back to her, then even her lethal body could never harm him. While he brushed off dirt and grumbled about the filthy surroundings, she watched him in quiet awe, reflecting on the dream of a family she had long abandoned, a deep bond she had deemed entirely impossible for someone like her. Overwhelmed by a sudden surge of passion and hope, she realized that with him, she might finally be able to love, build a home, and bear a child, causing her intense gaze and flushed face to completely startle the bewildered boy. She quickly tried to divert the conversation away from her earlier emotional outburst, questioning whether his claims about finding the Darksteel formula were merely a bluff, though he dryly brushed off her flustered state. Directing her attention to a detached wooden door lying upside down on the floor, he pointed out a subtle scratch running across its grain that he had initially overlooked. Upon propping the heavy door back against the stone wall, the young strategist realized that the height of the mark aligned perfectly with the young girl standing nearby. Confirming his suspicion, he measured the height of little Shia against the mark on the wood, deducing that her late father must have carved it shortly before his death. Connecting the clue to the father's final instructions, that the secret should only be revealed once his child grew taller than he was, he concluded that the secret was concealed directly within the stone wall above that mark. Reaching deep into a hidden cavity within the stonework, he triumphantly pulled out a folded parchment, shocking everyone by proving the Darksteel formula had been inside the workshop all along. With the mystery solved, he gently passed the priceless document into Shia's hands, affirming that it belonged solely to her. As her fingers brushed the paper, warm memories flooded back to the young girl, reminding her of the cherished moments spent in the forge alongside her mother and father. He went on to suggest that since she had no desire to become a blacksmith, she could sell the formula to reclaim her family mansion and freedom, but to their utter horror, she abruptly tore the parchment in half. While the little girl casually tossed the destroyed formula aside with a serene smile, both Rimuru and Nishina broke down into panicked screams over the destruction of the legendary blueprint. She beamed with a serene, unbothered smile, softly addressing him as her dear master and explaining that she had simply destroyed the formula so he could buy her freedom properly rather than treating her as a temporary necessity. Her calm declaration left both the boy and the martial artist thoroughly stunned. As the young girl's gentle gaze remained fixed on them, her companions realized the truth. She had deliberately hidden the Darksteel formula to ensure she remained tied to him. However, they quickly calculated that the money already recovered from Torque would be more than enough to buy back her freedom regardless. Unable to handle the overwhelming stress of the situation, the boy slumped over in exhaustion, claiming he felt dizzy and intended to turn himself in at the guard station to take responsibility. The black-haired warrior angrily confronted him, refusing to let him shift the blame or turn himself into a sacrificial lamb, while reminding him that a master must take proper care of his slave. Following the intense confrontation, the warrior embraced the young girl tightly, moved to tears by her devotion, and expressing relief that they had enough money to secure her freedom. The little girl simply offered a warm, comforting smile, entirely content with how everything had transpired. As the emotional embrace relaxed, the warrior playfully teased that she would not mind at all if the girl eventually fell in love with her master as well, provided it made him happy. With a confident and triumphant smile, the young girl boldly declared that she would be the only one standing by his side until the very end, causing the young master to sputter in flustered embarrassment. Days after the intense Darksteel incident had finally settled, the young master lay quietly in bed, resting his head on his arms as he pondered the recent chaotic events in peace. Time moved swiftly in the aftermath. 3 days after the case officially closed, the late boss's family vacated the guard housing, and another 3 days flew by after seeing the black-haired warrior off on her journey, though the boy had yet to reveal his final card to the guard station. Lying alone in the quiet room, he stared up at the ceiling, enjoying a moment of solitude amidst the calm that had finally returned to their lives. Outside, the young girl smiled softly to herself, appreciating how considerate everyone was being by allowing her time off, while quietly acknowledging that her big brother was likely feeling a bit lonely without them around. She sat nearby, murmuring softly with a sleepy stretch as she wondered about what lay ahead, while the young swordsman resting on the bed offered a quiet, grumbling response. Following their quiet exchange, the little girl shared a light-hearted laugh with Dora, who firmly resolved never again to go out of her way to get dragged into Nishina's chaotic troubles. Left with his own heavy thoughts, the resting youth stared quietly at the ceiling, dreading the unavoidable day that was bound to arrive sooner or later. In his mind's eye, painful memories began to surface, recalling hazy silhouettes from a dark past he could not erase. The vision grew clearer and grim, revealing the tragic recollection of helpless figures fallen motionless amidst blood and disaster. He vividly remembered reaching out with a desperate, trembling hand, completely helpless to save those who collapsed before him. Along with those painful images came the stern, sharp visage of a formidable man whose shadow continued to loom over his life. Returning to the peaceful present, the woman and child watched over his sleeping form, silently praying that such dark days would remain as far in the distance as possible. As he drifted deep into slumber, the quiet tranquility of the room was suddenly broken by a harsh rattling and knocking at the entrance. Shocked awake by the sudden racket, he bolted upright in bed, his eyes wide with utter confusion and alarm. He barely had time to react before a sudden, violent blow sent him crashing backward onto the bed, prompting a terrified cry from young Shia. Before he could recover from the impact, Nishina stood furiously over him, accusing him of sinister intentions while he stammered back in complete bewilderment. Driven by righteous indignation, she leaned close to bark harsh insults, claiming she never imagined he would sink so low as to trick a young girl into slavery. Unnerved by her wild allegations, he sat up on his bedding in a cold sweat, desperately trying to defend himself while Dora and Shia attempted to soothe the enraged woman. Amidst the chaotic argument, their attention was cut short when an elegantly dressed girl wearing a heavy metallic collar stepped through the curtain, calmly explaining that she had come looking for her master since he had failed to collect her. Stunned by her bizarre entrance, he immediately lunged forward and grabbed her shoulders, shaking her violently in utter disbelief while Nishina watched in utter shock. Demanding an immediate explanation for her sudden arrival, he continued to interrogate her forcefully, entirely unsettled by her blank and unbothered reaction. Instead of flinching at his panicked outburst, she closed the distance between them, leaning her head softly toward his face as her long hair fell over her shoulders. Leaning intimately right against his ear, she whispered that her binding slave collar guaranteed she could never harm him, promising that even if his deadly curse destroyed everyone else, she alone would remain by his side. Upon hearing her haunting declaration, he recoiled in pure horror as dread washed over his face, while she offered only a tranquil, chilling smile. His body slouched heavily under the weight of the revelation, unable to process the terrifying truth. Beside him, the young collared girl offered a gentle, knowing smile, softly murmuring that everything finally made sense to her. Slumping back onto his futon in utter despair, he could only bury his head in his hands, wondering how his life had taken such a bizarre turn. As Nishina stood watching nearby in silence, the the girl cheerfully asked her new master to take good care of her for a very long time to come. Rain poured relentlessly over the old red-light quarter of the East District. Standing under the dark downpour alongside a fellow guard apprentice, the silver-haired youth grumbled about how the endless rain was getting on his nerves. His companion, Apprentice Yufin of the East Gate Guard Corps, admitted that while the wet weather was certainly annoying, it was not entirely without its perks. He pointed out that hydrangeas bloomed best in the damp, to which the dark-haired youth countered dryly that pretty flowers could not fill an empty stomach and were poisonous besides. Laughing off the sharp retort, he teased his partner for sounding like a displaced noble. Continuing their walk through the quiet, drenched alleyways, the former noble explained that the storm offered another practical advantage. They could remain sheltered in one place without raising any suspicion from passersby. Taking cover under a wooden overhang, they agreed that the downpour made for ideal stakeout conditions, though the silver-haired apprentice expressed mild concern over their vice-captain's tardiness, wondering if he was botching his end of the task. His companion dismissed the concern with a smirk, noting that their acting captain was ill-suited for command anyway and would likely face severe backlash once a proper successor was appointed. Confirming his fellow guard's suspicion, he revealed that ever since their former leader was removed, the desperate acting captain had been frantic to secure a major victory, jumping blindly at a shady tip regarding an illegal black market auction. Meanwhile, down the main street, acting Captain Tarian marched at the head of the East Gate Guard Corps' primary force, his mind fixed solely on executing the raid despite the hushed doubts whispering among his men. He efficiently issued commands to his officers, directing veteran guard Colt to take Yufin and 5 men to secure and lock down the rear exit. Following his directives, the squad moved quietly through the rain, surrounding the secluded building under cover of darkness. With a sudden, unified roar, the East Gate Guard Corps breached the heavy doors and stormed the auction hall, catching the attendees off guard. The commanding officer barked orders to detain everyone without exception, sparking widespread panic as patrons scrambled to escape, while the collared young girl remained motionless amid the chaos. Once the venue was secured, Yufin marveled at the sheer volume of confiscated property, though Rimuru pointedly noted that his fellow apprentice had barely contributed to the raid. As they surveyed the captives, they were startled to find an arrogant young nobleman resting casually on a sofa, prompting immediate concern among the guards. Recognizing the risk of political fallout, Colt and his superior agreed to haul everyone away quickly before the presence of highborn individuals could complicate matters. Their hasty retreat was blocked, however, by strict protocol requiring them to await a full inspection, as suspected royal assets were believed to be mixed in with the illicit contraband. The tension heightened as Chief Inspector Victor Arthur Pell personally arrived on the scene to oversee the delicate operation. Reviewing the gathered evidence, the Chief Inspector questioned the guard in charge, who confirmed the inventory before hesitantly presenting the silent slave girl as a victim of human trafficking. He coldly observed that human beings were not classified among royal treasure. As the High Inspector turned and departed, the surrounding guards whispered in frustration about his rigid demeanor and unyielding authority, considering how difficult he was to deal with. They acknowledged that despite his abrasive personality, the man never bowed to political power, refused all bribes, and enforced judgment without regard for social status, instilling genuine fear among the nobility. With the inspection concluded and the main hall secured, the squad gathered their belongings and prepared to transfer the rescued captives. Shortly after, the focus shifted to the East Gate Guard Corps station, deep within the holding cells where secure debriefings were conducted. Settled comfortably inside a warm office, the freed young girl was reassured by the guards before softly offering her name as Nearest. She went on to explain her tragic past, detailing how her grandparents had perished in the war, prompting her journey towards St. Togan to locate her mother, only to be abducted along the way. Hearing her plight, the acting captain gently proposed searching for her mother so they could be reunited, asking her for physical features and a name to aid their search. The young girl quietly answered that her mother's name was Ridley, sharing the exact same silver hair and striking eyes as her own. As she lowered her gaze, the young silver-haired boy urged his superior to write down her formal statement to initiate the missing person's search immediately. Her immediate care was assigned to a veteran officer who offered his spare bedroom. He explained to the young recruits as they stepped into the bustling town square that his wife would be delighted to host the girl while they conducted their search. He reviewed the assignment with a calm nod, recognizing that securing a safe haven for her was a vital first step before beginning the search for her mother. His moment of quiet reflection was abruptly shattered when an arrogant, pompous voice called out across the street, targeting him directly. He recognized the visitor with a sense of dread. It was the very same noble youth he had been forced to set free just the day before. He lunged forward aggressively, seizing the apprentice's shoulder while shouting furiously, demanding the return of the silver-haired girl he insisted was his property from the black market auction. He was Hebert Cornet, the spoiled scion of the head of the Public Safety Bureau. He continued to rant, questioning why anyone of noble standing would fuss over a common country girl, until a piercing, frigid gaze from the apprentice brought him to a sudden halt. He watched in quiet detachment as the spoiled noble youth threw a screaming temper tantrum, raving at the top of his lungs that he would accept no one else but Nearest. Unable to get his way, the arrogant noble turned on his heel and stormed off, spitting venomous insults while Rimuru could only sigh at such petty arrogance. As the young master's figure receded in the distance, Rimuru pondered what could possibly drive such fanatical obsession, doubting it was anything as noble as love at first sight. Later, back at the guard post, the young recruits unwound over rations, trading light-hearted banter and ribbing each other about their recent duties and punished squadmates. Over their meal, the conversation shifted back to the incident as one of the guards naively suggested that surrendering Nearest might settle the conflict if her suitor truly cared for her. Without a moment's hesitation, Rimuru firmly shut down the suggestion as they finished eating and prepared to report to their superiors. Looking his squadmate dead in the eye, he emphasized that the noble's intentions were far darker than genuine affection, seeing straight through the arrogant facade. Their debate was cut short as Director Luz joined them, chuckling grimly as he described how furiously the young noble had demanded answers when confronted at the office. Addressing the buzzcut guard directly, Luz ordered Colt to remain vigilant and make certain Nearest did not wander off unattended under any circumstances. Leaning in with a gravitas that brooked no argument, he warned all three young guards to keep Nearest's whereabouts strictly confidential from the rest of the garrison. His exasperation only grew as his son hurled a final, venomous outburst specifically at the silver-haired guard before storming off. Back at the family manor, the director of public safety made it clear to Belcroche that demanding the immediate dismissal of every guard stationed at the East Gate was far beyond reason, regardless of his status as a favored child. He explained that with 2 captains killed in rapid succession, the East District had become a high-priority public safety zone, warning that drawing unwanted scrutiny from the royal family could lead to royal knights taking over the command. Unmoved by political risk, the young noble shouted that the girl was the exact image of a woman named Ridley, offering endless funds to secure her, which finally prompted his father to agree to handle the matter through covert means. Believing guards were easily bought, the director instructed a discreet operative to trace the girl's location and buy off anyone necessary, setting a quiet scheme into motion over the next 2 weeks. 14 days passed quietly since the major raid, leaving the young guard leaning against the barracks window in deep thought. Given how fanatically obsessed the noble had seemed with Nearest, he had fully anticipated a swift retaliation. Yet, as he pondered the quiet spell, a fellow guard nudged him with a light warning not to slack off on duty, to which he simply remarked that a lack of trouble was the best outcome possible. Meanwhile, reviewing their sparse leads, Klinsmann noted that the last known trace of her pointed to a small diner in the West District, keeping their quiet investigation alive. As he stood among his fellow guards, he overheard them suddenly questioning the whereabouts of another comrade, Manito, whom no one had seen recently. Upon inquiring further, the guards were stunned to learn that Manito had abruptly submitted a letter of resignation a short while prior. According to his note, Manito claimed to have struck it rich at an illegal gambling parlor and was abandoning his duties to start a new business in another country. Baffled by such reckless behavior, the young catboy reacted with disbelief, finding it hard to comprehend how someone could throw away their guard status so carelessly. In contrast to Manito's sudden departure, the The conversation shifted to dedicated veterans like Colt, who had softened his once intimidating nature over the years to work diligently until retirement. His fellow guards fondly recalled how soft Colt had become ever since his own daughter grew up and moved out, noting that he had even grown quite attached to young Nearest. Chuckling at Colt's protective paternal streak, Rimuru teased that once they successfully reunited Nearest with her mother, the old guard would have to learn to let her go. 3 days passed quietly after their chat, until a violent crash suddenly shattered the silence at one of the guard posts. Ambushed in the dark by shadowy, unknown assailants, the veteran guard collapsed under a sudden, brutal assault. Gasping for air as blood spilled from his lips, Colt lay helpless on the floor, gravely wounded in the unexpected ambush. He lay collapsed on the dark floor, his physical strength rapidly draining as shadows loomed ominously over his prone body. Desperately clawing at the stone, he reached out with a trembling hand, groaning out a feeble plea for the shadowy intruder to halt. Blood running down his bruised forehead, his vision began to blur. Yet with his dying strength, he called out Nearest's name before slipping into unconsciousness. News of the sudden assault rippled through the guard station, leaving the young recruits reeling as they learned that Colt's residence had been targeted. The attack had left the home in complete disarray, with furniture overturned and signs of a violent struggle scattered across the floor. While Colt and his wife had barely survived their injuries, Nearest had been taken without a trace. As the young warrior realized the ominous implications of her abduction, Guard Klinsman suddenly burst into the room to deliver an urgent report to Acting Captain Luz. He urgently announced that they had finally located the trail of Nearest's missing mother. The revelation struck the room like a thunderbolt when Klinsman named the household as belonging to Lord Cornet, the director of the Public Safety Bureau. Connecting the dots, the young swordsman realized that after Nearest's mother disappeared while working for the Cornet family, Nearest had now been targeted in the exact same manner. Incensed by the truth, Acting Captain Luz charged down the stairs with thunderous footsteps, instantly identifying Lord Cornet's obsessive son, Belcroche, as the culprit behind both abductions. While his fiery declaration still hung in the air, the remaining guards sat inside the bureau, defeatedly insisting that no official action could be taken without absolute, indisputable proof. Outside the quiet quarters, whispers lingered about how such reluctance to act without orders was precisely why leadership was beyond their grasp. Turning away from the indecisive officers, the young silver-haired warrior made his way down the quiet corridor, searching for the room where his injured comrade lay. Upon stepping inside, he found the middle-aged woman sitting dutifully by the bedside, her weary eyes looking up in mild surprise as she acknowledged his arrival. Standing beside her, he gave a somber assessment of their family's precarious condition, leaving her to clutch her hands in anguish as she racked her mind over who could commit such a cruel atrocity. Looking down at her quietly, he asked if she felt genuine hatred toward the perpetrators responsible for bringing this tragedy upon them. The question struck a raw nerve, causing her eyes to widen with a sudden, fierce flash of unbridled rage. Lurching forward with overwhelming emotion, she snapped fiercely at him, shouting that the answer was brutally obvious to anyone who had suffered such loss. Slumping back down, her voice softened into a bitter tremble as she noted that while the city watch might apprehend the foot soldiers who executed the assault, that would be the absolute limit of their justice. Listening intently, the young warrior knew in his heart that the guards would never possess the power or reach to hold the true mastermind accountable. He decides that official guard protocols will no longer suffice, resolving to take matters into his own hands under his shadow moniker, Silver Cat. Stepping away from the bedside, he leaves the quiet residence where Dora remains to tend to the injured Colt. Inside the room, the woman gazes toward the window, suddenly realizing how much time has slipped away while nursing the bedridden guard. Her quiet reflection is shattered when she turns to find mysterious hooded figures standing silently near the threshold. Overcoming her initial shock, she offers the cloaked visitor precise directions, advising her to venture down the third road on Heartless Street before dusk to find what she seeks. With a respectful bow, the visitor formally accepts the request before taking her leave into the alley. As they move out, an associate questions the target of the assignment, pointing out that the offered payment seems far too small for such a dangerous undertaking. The young silver-haired warrior steps forward to guarantee the reward, declaring that he will personally cover the financial shortfall because he cannot turn a blind eye to this injustice. The dialogue deepens into the underworld's history, revealing that a woman named Yurikara operates openly as a slave trader while secretly leading the assassin group known as the Night Dwellers. Legitimate traders cut ties with House Cornet after countless slaves met horrific deaths under the guise of tragic accidents. They conclude that following the recent black auction scandal, the noble house continues to acquire slaves through illicit channels, where those same brutal fates undoubtedly await them. He could not forgive such cold-hearted atrocities, glaring at the reports detailing Belcroche Cornet's abusive exploitation of his slaves. Turning to his hooded contact, he inquired whether any new intel had been gathered regarding Lord Cornet and his heir, Belcroche. The hooded leader disclosed the grim reality. Belcroche had locked himself inside the manor's subterranean vault alongside his newest captive girl, stockpiling provisions inside. Because the heavy blast doors could only be unsealed from within and the external vent pipe was barely wider than a human wrist, direct infiltration or rescue seemed completely out of the question. When he suggested dispatching the top-rank operative known as Black of Judgment to breach the fortress, she shut down the proposal instantly, catching him off guard. She pointed out that while that assassin's devastating technique could easily kill Belcroche, the innocent captive girl would inevitably be crushed alongside him. Not to mention that lethal operative was the last person on Earth she ever wished to encounter. Instead, she outlined a coordinated strike using 3 specialized assassins: Creeper in the Dark, Undying King, and Worst. She instructed him to personally deliver the assignment to Undying King and Worst, while taking charge of Creeper in the Dark herself. Accepting the plan, he quietly nodded in agreement as she turned away into the shadows. With the strategy finalized, she walked quietly down the dim corridor. Stopping near the wall, she addressed the dark corners of the room, asking if the hidden figure had overheard every word. Stepping out from the darkness, a shadowy assassin wearing a fedora bowed low with a sinister grin, confirming that he had indeed heard all of it. Adjusting his top hat and monocle, the sinister conspirator mockingly suggested that superior individuals like them ought to rule the kingdom, musing aloud whether the current state of governance was truly a blessing for anyone. Unmoved by his grandiose declaration, she calmly corrected him, stating that his faction's perceived superiority was merely an illusion born of their own deep-seated distortions. Accepting her harsh rebuttal with a dark grin, he noted that so long as she fulfilled her assigned duties, he was content to let her hold onto her beliefs while they proceeded to reshape the world. With a quiet puff, the candle flame flickered out, plunging the clandestine meeting into absolute darkness. Elsewhere, the young swordsman conferred with his bruised and exhausted companion, who reflected bitterly on how painful it was to survive in a realm rife with deceit and betrayal. Entrusting the rest of the critical mission to the capable youth, the wounded ally offered a faint nod of encouragement. Stepping quietly beneath the shroud of night, his boots crossed the iron gates as the hour for retribution finally arrived. Standing resolved before the moonlit manor of the corrupt nobles, he prepared to execute his infiltration operation. With a sharp snap of his fingers, a luminous magical barrier expanded across the estate's perimeter, completely sealing off the mansion from the outside world. His eyes narrowing into a fierce, cold glare, he whispered to himself that the time had come to begin. Having cast his magical perimeter around the estate, he raced across the sloped roof in his feline form, bounding toward an open window in the high walls of the Cornet mansion. Landing silently on a stone ledge outside a low entrance, he paused beside a small orb before approaching a subterranean hatch at the base of the grand building. With a gentle nudge of his snout, he pushed open the wooden flap and slipped effortlessly into the dark interior of the mansion. Inside the pitch-black corridor, he looked up as a beam of moonlight illuminated a small object tumbling silently down from the ceiling rafters above. Meanwhile, deeper within the estate's quarters, a group of off-duty guards gathered around a wooden table, cheering and drinking heavily to celebrate their evening ease. Among them sat Colt, the young buzzcut guard, who listened intently as his companions discussed the mansion's steward while he secretly inquired about the whereabouts of the captive girl, Neris. Leaning back over stacks of ill-gotten coins, Colt convinced himself that his underhanded schemes were justified, reasoning that locating the girl would surely win him immense favor and rapid promotion from his master. When an older officer interrupted the gathering, Colt stood his ground, loudly defending his ruthless ambition by declaring that anyone who ever achieved greatness had to get their hands dirty. Emboldened by his own rhetoric, he slammed his hands on the table, bitterly recalling his father who spent his life as a humble village blacksmith and vowing never to end up a helpless loser like him. His dramatic outburst, however, was met only with booming laughter from the seasoned veterans, who mockingly dismissed him as a naive, foolish child and left him trembling with indignation. His silent rage was suddenly interrupted by an eerie, soothing voice whispering from the shadows, assuring him that his ambitious desires were perfectly natural for someone of talent. Before the young guard could process the strange words, a sudden clatter echoed across the dining hall, causing the surrounding men to leap from their seats in shock. As chaos erupted, monstrous shadowy tendrils materialized out of thin air, reaching down to seize the panicked soldiers. Terrified cries filled the room as one by one, the guards were dragged into the darkness, leaving those remaining to shout in frantic confusion as their comrades vanished. Unable to fight back against the living darkness, the men recoiled in sheer panic as shadow hands struck from every corner. The overwhelming assault transformed the mess hall into a nightmarish trap, leaving the young aspiring guard trembling on his feet as screams echoed around him. In a desperate bid to escape the shadowy abyss, a few attempted to bolt toward the heavy wooden doors, only to find the exits barred and shrouded in impenetrable darkness. As the commotion subsided into a chilling silence, a tall figure clad in a dark suit and top hat stepped out from the gloom, mockingly tipping his hat to the cowering soldier. He glided forward with unsettling grace, explaining his dark nature while the helpless youth scrambled backward along the floor, whimpering for help that would not come. Standing over his utterly broken victim, the mysterious intruder offered a mocking bow, sinisterly retracting his earlier praise and leaving the boy paralyzed in absolute terror. As he cowered helplessly on the floor, the shadowy intruder patted his head with mocking pity. The top-hatted figure sneered, commenting that despite the young guard's grand ambitions, he had vastly overrated his own worth, calling it pathetic that such a minor threat had broken his spirit. Desperate and overwhelmed by sheer terror, the young man could only cry out in tears, desperately pleading for it. With his cruel task complete, the mysterious stranger offered a dramatic bow before vanishing into thin air, leaving no trace behind. Deep within the mansion's subterranean dungeon, a far more overt brutality was underway. Belcroche Cornet maniacally lashed a whip across Neris's bare back, taking sadistic pleasure in the fresh bloody whilst marking her pale skin. As she cried out in agony, the young nobleman gloated over his cruelty, raving madly about hunting down the stray cat who dared cross him, while his unhinged laughter echoed off the cold stone walls. Inside the dungeon, Belcroche Cornet savagely strikes Neris with his whip, ignoring her frantic pleas for mercy as she hangs suspended from the ceiling in total confusion and pain. Continuing his cruel assault, he gleefully taunts her by recalling how much delight he took in torturing her mother, while a tall, shadowed figure in a top hat stands in the background watching the display. Stunned by the horrific revelation, she breaks down in tears, unable to process the agony of learning her mother called out her name until her dying breath. Seeing her anguish, he grins maniacally, promising that he will personally deliver the exact same gruesome death to her. Amidst his vile threats, a subtle dark fluid suddenly begins to bubble and spill across the dungeon floor near a dropped weapon. Oblivious to the anomaly, the nobleman continues his depraved rambling, declaring how thrilling it will be to slowly choke the life out of her body. The dark essence expands rapidly across the cold chamber, enveloping the shadow of her suspended form while he revels in her weakening vitality. Terrified and reaching her absolute limit, she desperately screams into the gloom for help, prompting him to burst into arrogant laughter and boast that no soul could ever enter this hidden lair. Instantly shattering his arrogance, a cold steel blade presses against his throat from behind as an unexpected intruder quietly refutes his claim. He froze in sheer terror as a lethal edge rested against his throat, unable to comprehend how anyone could breach his utterly secure sanctuary. His captor calmly mused that impossible things occur all the time, comparing the feat to monsters capable of regenerating from the smallest remnant. Panicking, he demanded to know the intruder's identity, only to receive a chilling reply that he was facing a creature of the night. Before he could utter another word, the shadow-bound intruder overpowered him effortlessly, lifting him as his vision faded into dark gasps of disbelief. The tall, wild-haired warrior callously siphoned his life force, noting with dark sarcasm that consuming a soul was a rare luxury, just as death itself would be a luxury for an immortal human. Ignoring his weak groans, the warrior casually announced that he was granting him a taste of that very luxury, dismissing any need for gratitude as the nobleman collapsed. Turning his attention to the captive girl hanging from the ceiling, he exhaled in relief and gently cut her bindings, warning her to keep her blindfold on so he wouldn't be forced to eliminate her if she saw his face. With her safely untied, he scooped her up into his arms and carried her away from the dark torture chamber into the corridors beyond. Emerging into the cool night air, he carried her through a lush courtyard, coming across the young guard apprentice who stood waiting with a bundle of clothes. He instructed the youth to take the girl and place her somewhere safe where the incoming night order could find her. He watched intently as the nobleman quietly marveled at the rare blue hydrangeas blooming in full glory across the mansion estate. A chilling thought lingered in the air, deeming the nature of the vibrant flowers deeply sinful. Listening in on the surrounding commotion, he caught wind of the estate officials' heated arguments regarding a noble who had mysteriously vanished after demanding an audience. Turning unfazed by the hostility, he pointed out that since no body had been recovered, the woman might still be alive, reminding the officer that she had worked right here in the mansion as a maid. Gesturing toward the courtyard, the conversation shifted to the unusual flora surrounding them, noting how strange it was for blue hydrangeas to grow here when red ones were standard throughout the region. The official explained that hydrangea colors were dictated by the nutrients in the soil beneath them, revealing that blue blossoms only appeared in 2 specific locations in the realm. A somber gravity fell upon them as the officer revealed the gruesome truth. Soil nourished by decomposing corpses turns hydrangeas blue, exposing the beautiful courtyard as a hidden mass grave and execution site. Staring down at the vibrant blossoms, he absorbed the horrifying realization that the breathtaking blue flowers drew their life and color from the remains of countless murdered victims beneath the earth. With the disturbing truth uncovered, he took advantage of the situation, slyly accepting the news that the commander position for the East Gate Guard Squad was now vacant and up for grabs. He took his leave from the grief-stricken noble with a polite farewell, turning his back on the gloomy mansion and its dark secrets. As he walked away, his parting words cut deeply, reminding the man that his son's tragic end was the inevitable result of his own overindulgence. Continuing down the path, he mused that such spoiling was never true love, but merely a parent's selfish attempt at self-satisfaction. Lowering his gaze, he was reminded of someone from his own past, someone foolishly strict who would beat him back onto the right path whenever he strayed. Memories of harsh training and stern discipline flashed before him, agonizing in the moment, yet revealing their true worth once they were gone. Shadowed beneath his bangs, he quietly admitted to himself that despite the pain, that relentless discipline was what genuine parental affection actually felt like. In the days that followed, quiet reunions unfolded elsewhere while life slowly returned to normal around the guard station. Sitting slouched on the floor after strenuous duty, he listened as Yufin detailed the massive scandal that had erupted after multiple skeletons were uncovered in Lord Cornet's garden, leading high-ranking nobles and the Imperial Guard to raid the estate and arrest the corrupted lord and his conspirators. Meanwhile, Nereus rested safely in bed surrounded by supportive comrades, having secured a fresh start working at the guard quarters while Colt prepared to officially adopt her. Leaning back with a weary breath, he listened to Yufin mention that acting Captain Tarian's promotion had fallen through, finding comfort in the realization that his chaotic double life as a guard apprentice and shadow operative had settled back into a peaceful routine. He overheard the hushed rumors sweeping through the guard barracks. To rebuild order after the recent scandal, The Royal Guard captain was allegedly taking over as head of the Security Bureau, or perhaps a brand new captain was being dispatched directly from the Night Order. Joining the rest of the young guards during a break, he listened as his companions voiced their anxieties about this mysterious new leader, quietly hoping for someone far more forgiving than their previous harsh drill masters. Leaning back with his hands behind his head, the silver-haired youth casually agreed that an easygoing boss would certainly make all their lives much easier. Yet, far from the relaxed chatter of the barracks, heavy, echoing footsteps began to resound down the grand polished corridors of the headquarters as an imposing figure made her approach. Cloaked in ornate, etched armor and bearing an intense, unwavering gaze, the formidable new Knight Commander arrived to assume total control, signaling a dramatic shift for the entire guard unit. Deep in the capital at night, a quiet brick building stands under the dark sky, serving as a covert gathering place. Along its exterior brick wall, subtle echoes of chatter drift out from a second-story window. The closed glass pane vibrates gently as the conversation inside grows more animated. Inside the room, the silver-haired young assassin listens in disbelief as two energetic young girls press him about their latest assignment. Puffing their cheeks in identical frustration, they proudly identify themselves as top-tier rank A assassins assigned to safeguard the princess. He attempts to calm the duo, raising his hands while questioning why elite operatives like them would take on an odd-job guard role. Observing them closely, he marvels at their uncanny mirror image, noting how their voices, expressions, and hairstyles align perfectly despite subtle hand preferences. Standing quietly nearby, their hooded contact interjects to clarify that the contract specifically requires eliminating anyone plotting against the princess. He sighs in exasperation at the explanation, complaining that a low-ranking guard apprentice should never be entangled in high-stakes royal affairs. Paying no mind to his complaints, the energetic twins gleefully throw their arms around him, declaring their affection while he fruitlessly tries to shoo them away. He struggled in vain as the twin assassins clung tightly to his arms, bombarding him with unyielding enthusiasm while he fruitlessly shouted for them to give him space. As the commotion settled slightly, the masked client clarified that the twins were actually acting as the intermediaries for this job, which involved a high-profile target with deep pockets and dangerous political entanglements. Staring in deadpan disbelief, he questioned why he needed to be involved at all if he was never going to interact with the princess directly, only for the twins to tearfully plead that their monthly allowance was on the line. The hooded figure calmly continued setting terms while he interjected, desperately trying to freeze the conversation before they locked him into an outrageous contract. The client smoothly proposed that he could simply start by hunting down the malicious individuals currently targeting the young lady, a suggestion that sent the twins into cheers while he shouted in protest until night gave way to the following morning. With the new day underway, he darted recklessly through the bustling market district, weaving through the crowded thoroughfare while shouting apologies to startled passers-by. Shouting for the crowd to clear a path, he sprinted at full speed through the narrow alleys, leaving bewildered townsfolk in his wake. Observing his frantic dash, the gathered citizens murmured among themselves in curiosity, wondering what could possibly have driven him to run so desperately late into the morning. Echoes of the lingering dispute rang through his mind as he pushed his feet to run even faster through the cobblestone paths. Huffing heavily from the intense physical exertion, he grumbled under his breath about the chaotic demands piling upon him since the morning, resolved to settle the matter as quickly as possible. He lay trapped in bed, watching the serene face of the young girl resting peacefully beside him. He winced as she stirred softly in her sleep, a weary groan escaping his lips while he tried to shift away without waking her. He felt his mind race with frustration over the nightly ordeal, unable to get a proper rest while squeezed so tightly in bed. Meanwhile, Inspector Pell observed the situation with a sharp eye, asking what could possibly be troubling the young guard so deeply. He quickly brushed the thought away, deciding it was best not to pry any further into the youth's endless domestic complaints. Bursting through the doors moments later, the exhausted youth threw his hands up in panic, wildly spouting an elaborate story about a sudden family fever to excuse his lateness. Stopping dead in his tracks, he scanned the strangely quiet, empty room, wonderingly asking himself if he had somehow mistaken today for a day off. He wiped the sweat from his brow as he walked down the corridor, feeling an unsettling presage begin to gnaw at him. As he reached the open doorway, he froze in sheer surprise upon seeing all his fellow guards standing in strict formation. He clutched his head in sudden horror as he finally remembered the critical announcement. A new commander was taking charge today, and he was late. He looked across the courtyard in utter shock, noticing that every single guard was standing rigid with pure, unadulterated tension. Scanning the ranks, he saw Yufin, Klinsman, and even acting Captain Tarian trembling. A man who had carried himself like a king just yesterday was now sweating bullets. Falling to his knees alongside them, the sheer weight of the atmosphere made his own knees shake uncontrollably. Swallowing hard, he began to panic, wondering what kind of terrifying monster could possibly instill such utter dread in the entire station. Before he could make sense of the situation, a hand clamped onto the back of his shirt and hoisted him off his feet, prompting him to yell out in pain and confusion. As he spun around, his jaw dropped in disbelief when he found himself face to face with a fiercely handsome woman clad in immaculate silver armor. Dangling effortlessly from her grasp like a helpless rag doll, he remained completely paralyzed by her overwhelming presence. Her cold, sharp gaze locked onto his bewildered eyes, assessing him with an aura of total authority. Leaning in close, she insultingly declared that his eyes looked utterly dead, igniting a flare of indignation within him as he struggled against her firm grip. Dropping him unceremoniously to the ground, she turned her attention to the former captain, who bowed trembling before her, addressing her respectfully as Commander Granada. The fierce warrior commander looked down sternly at the trembling officers, questioning whether Tarian was truly the master of such a dysfunctional office. In response, Rimuru sheepishly scratched the back of his neck, feigning humility and jokingly claiming that he was nothing more than an incompetent slacker who had been wildly overvalued. Observing his attempts to laugh off the situation, she expressed her disdain, remarking that making glib jokes during a crisis revealed whether a soldier possessed true grit or a thoroughly rotten nature. Bowing his head under her intense glare, he muttered a tense apology as he realized just how deep of a hole he was digging. Dismissing his excuses, she announced with absolute authority that starting that very day, she would personally break them down and correct their flawed attitudes from the ground up, commanding them to prepare themselves while he squirmed in quiet anxiety. When questioned further about her position, she clarified that she was actually the vice commander of the unit. The announcement left him thoroughly baffled, leading him to wonder aloud who could possibly hold higher authority than her, until she raised her arm and gestured toward the noble figure seated further inside. Seated in elegant splendor upon the central chair was Her Royal Highness Princess Astrea, 18th in line to the imperial throne. Recognizing the young royal, he recoiled in utter disbelief, his mind racing as he connected the dots to the request he had received the previous day. He realized with sudden dread that the high-status individual mentioned in the mission was none other than the princess herself. Turning back toward the formidable vice commander, he stammered in confusion, asking if this was some kind of absurd joke and demanding to know why an actual member of the royal family was present in a humble gatehouse. Her expression hardened into a terrifying glare as she loomed over him, coldly repeating that she held no affection for foolish jokes, sending a wave of absolute horror washing over him. Turning her back on him, she marched with rhythmic, ringing footsteps across the stone floor toward the princess's side. Standing proudly beside the throne, she bellowed an official proclamation to the entire assembly, declaring that the East Gate Guard headquarters was now under the direct command of Princess Astrea, and promising that as third-rank Knight Granada de Lesson, she would ruthlessly reshape every single one of their lazy souls. Her flamboyant, full-body plate armor brought a sudden realization to the young guard apprentice. In this realm, such elaborate protection was worn only by elite units under direct royal command, such as the Royal Guard. Connecting the clues, he remembered the whispered tales of the Sword Princess of the present era, the legendary Crimson Sword Princess whose martial prowess was absolute, a knight named Granada. As she roared at the recruits, calling them useless maggots, he could only sigh in silent dread, realizing that a fiery, hot-headed commander and a gloomy guy like himself were the absolute worst match imaginable. Walking through the bustling town streets alongside his companions, the young white-haired boy glances back with a scowl, openly expressing his distaste for the arrogant demeanor of the wealthy nobles they had just encountered. Beside him, the female knight nods in quiet agreement as they escort the young princess. Noticing his lingering frustration, she casts a knowing side glance toward him, questioning if he truly intends to pretend he didn't notice what was really happening. He clicks his tongue in annoyance, caught off guard by how easily she saw right through his sharp exterior. As the faint jingle of coins rings from his purse, he groans aloud, bitterly complaining about how tight their finances are going to be for the upcoming month. She turns to him with a beaming, cheerful smile, playfully reassuring him that their good deeds will surely earn them a place in heaven, prompting him to shout back in annoyance. With a begrudging sigh, he mutters under his breath, reluctantly conceding that she might be slightly right as the group continues down the cobblestone path. A short while later, the heavy wooden doors of a lively establishment swing wide open, revealing the warm ambience and energetic chatter of a crowded tavern. Inside, he approaches a table where his well-dressed associate rests, asking in bewilderment why someone like him would invite a low-ranking guy out for a drink. The older gentleman chuckles, replying that there is nothing wrong with catching up once in a while. Taking a seat, he fumes over the terrible day he had, loudly venting about the obnoxious individual who went out of his way to delay them, declaring he'd love to knock the man flat. His associate listens calmly, acknowledging the exasperating trouble they were forced to endure. Slumping forward over his table, his eyelids heavy with exhaustion, he lets out one final bitter curse. He slammed his hands down, bitterly reliving the brutal regimen imposed by the sadist female knight who had driven them without rest until sunset. As he continued his tirade, his companion calmly inquired whether he had truly failed to glimpse the culprit during the incident, to which he admitted being knocked unconscious from behind before seeing who killed the commander. He questioned the king's wisdom in assigning such a commander right when war loomed, shuddering at the thought of enduring that relentless woman's grueling drills every single day. Sensing a shift in the atmosphere, his companion suddenly fidgeted, clearing his throat with a nervous blush before confessing he had something personal to disclose. With a dreamy, enamored expression, the older man dramatically declared that he was in love, leaving the boy utterly speechless. Recovering from his initial shock, he demanded to know who could have won over someone so notoriously picky, only for the man to bashfully reply that his crush was an angel. Staring in utter disbelief at the mustache-bearing man in his mid-30s referring to his love interest as an angel, he could only roll his eyes at the sheer absurdity. His dread only deepened when the man suddenly leaned forward with an intense, deadly serious glare, announcing that he needed a favor. Fixing him with a stern gaze, the man instructed him to use his loose, talkative mouth for something useful by showering him with praise in front of his beloved angel. Though he shouted in loud protest against such a ridiculous proposal, his outrage vanished the moment the man offered to boost his official work evaluation in return. He watched intently as his superior slid a pouch of funds across the table, sweetening the deal by promising not only a favorable work evaluation but also extra squad allowance if the plan succeeded. His eyes sparkled with immediate enthusiasm at the bribe, and he thumped his chest with supreme confidence, boldly promising that the task was as good as done. Eager to fulfill his end of the bargain, he agreed to the proposal and pressed for details, asking exactly which maiden his companion was referring to as an angel. Before he could get a clear answer, his attention was abruptly drawn toward the entrance of the establishment, where a striking dancer was gracefully stepping into the room. As the alluring woman glided forward surrounded by an air of elegance, his superior burst into ecstatic applause while he stood frozen in utter disbelief. He listened as his companion whispered the dancer's name, confirming that the gorgeous entertainer known as Remurim was indeed the object of his affection. Slowly turning his gaze toward the older man, he glared with deep skepticism and mounting irritation at the absurdity of the revelation. His annoyance deepened when his superior began panicking at the woman's approach, frantically debating whether to pretend to be a complete stranger. Before he could push the panicked man away, the captivating dancer slid right into the booth beside him, leaning dangerously close and teasingly asking if he had missed her. She immediately dragged him into a tight, suffocating headlock, leaving the surrounding tavern patrons whispering in shock, while his companion looked on in stunned disbelief, demanding to know what their true relationship was. He struggled to catch his breath under the woman's suffocating embrace, while the sleek gentleman beside them began to sweat profusely, frantically calculating how this disastrous display might ruin his professional standing. Attempting to salvage the awkward situation, the suited man offered a nervous smile, trying to act as if everything were perfectly normal despite the obvious tension between the young boy and his sudden suitor. He quickly shifted the focus to introducing his refined superior, hoping to impress her, but she barely spared a glance, remaining entirely fixated on the youth in her arms. Snapping sharply at his tone, she made no effort to hide her annoyance, leaving him muttering curses under his breath as his smooth composure completely crumbled. In a desperate bid to win her over, he began dramatically recounting the legendary virtues of his boss, painting him as a noble knight who rescued lost children and upheld justice throughout the land. However, she immediately cut through his glowing praise, calmly pointing out the man's notoriously lazy habits and embarrassing past behavior, much to the shock of the listening boy. Flustered by her blunt revelations, he shouted excuses in a frenzy, trying to defend his superior's honor while she remained utterly unfazed by his panic. Dismissing his frantic babbling with a wave of her hand, she brought the entire conversation to a grinding halt, refusing to waste another second on his excuses. Her expression softened into a rare moment of deep contemplation as she stared off, quietly weighing her true intentions and wondering what her next move should be. Nibbling absent-mindedly on a snack, she confessed to feeling a strange, unfamiliar emotion stir within her, leaving the young boy staring at her in bewilderment as he tried to fathom her unpredictable nature. She leaned in dangerously close, her dark eyes locking onto his flustered, blushing face as he stammered in utter confusion. Stepping forward with deliberate grace, she forced the boy to retreat step by step until he had nowhere left to run. With a chillingly serene expression, she whispered a quiet apology under her breath, warning that if he were to die from what was about to happen, she was truly sorry. Before he could make sense of her cryptic words, she pulled him into a sudden, forceful embrace directly before their stunned companion. Closing her eyes, she pressed her lips against his in an intense, overwhelming kiss that caught him completely off guard. The sudden intimacy sent shockwaves through the observer, who could only watch in wide-eyed disbelief as the embrace deepened. She continued to press him down onto the table, pinning him tight as the atmosphere around them took a sudden, sinister turn. Suddenly, a violent pulse of dark magic erupted from within the boy, flashing violently as an automatic self-defense mechanism flared to life. Breaking free and collapsing back onto his feet, he gasped heavily for air, his eyes widening in shock and rage as he realized his ancient curse had just been forcibly triggered. The terrifying truth slammed into his mind. His curse only activates when someone attempts to inflict mortal harm upon him, revealing that her kiss was a calculated attempt on his life. His teeth gritted with indignation as he lashed out, demanding to know what malicious scheme she was trying to pull with her deceptive kiss. Defiant against what he assumed was an assassination attempt, the young warrior declared that whatever trap she had set would never work on him, even as she looked back at him in stunned bewilderment and softly asked if he was truly feeling all right. Still, before he could process her concern, she suddenly threw her arms around him in a tight, overwhelming embrace, catching him completely off guard with a startled yell. Overjoyed by this sudden revelation, she began dancing around with giddy delight, realizing that her deadliest curse had failed to harm him, while he looked on in sheer confusion. In truth, her burden had always been a solitary one, as every fluid produced by her body was a fatal poison, forcing her to abandon any hope of normal human connection. She had resigned herself to an existence of perpetual isolation, believing she would spend her entire life untouched and alone, until this very moment proved otherwise. Connecting the pieces, he came to a startling realization of his own, remembering how his defensive curse automatically reverses any lethal attack aimed at him, meaning her poisonous attempt had been safely nullified because her body was immune to her own venom. Flushed with wild excitement and uninhibited passion, she locked him in a smothering hold and blurted out a shamelessly direct proposal to bear his children, leaving him frozen in utter shock. Surrounded by a troupe of eccentric women, a mysterious dancer, a strange young girl, and a sister who routinely snuck into his room at night. He could not help but ponder if his life was devolving into a chaotic dynamic he never asked for. Adding to his mounting headaches, the prospect of a notoriously stern female knight becoming his immediate superior left him feeling as though his peaceful future had been completely ruined. Sweat beaded on his brow as he realized with growing dread that his life's trajectory was veering dangerously off course. Meanwhile, as they made their way back to their quarters after taking down a board member, the dancer opened up about her past, speaking candidly of her desire for vengeance against the woman who had ruined her life. She explained that although she was born bound by a curse and believed she was destined to die isolated without forging bonds, meeting him had rekindled a small spark of hope that they could form a true family together. Yet a somber memory intruded upon her thoughts, reminding her of a harsh warning that anyone close to her master was ultimately fated to perish, threatening to shatter her newfound hope. Reclaiming her composure, she concluded that as long as her master remained happy, nothing else truly mattered, even as he observed her with quiet concern. Turning back toward him with a subtle, knowing gaze, she addressed him directly, her enigmatic demeanor masking the deeper shadows of the secret assassin group operating in the background. She lunged forward, grabbing him tightly as she blurted out an outrageous demand to have a child together right then and there. He recoiled in sheer terror, his scream echoing through the room as his mind raced to comprehend her curse, recalling how its power operated both actively and passively to deflect any lethal blow. Demanding an explanation, he pointed out that she had just tried to kill him by exploiting a moment of distraction, to which she awkwardly confessed that finding an alternative had been an agonizing dilemma. She bluntly berated his character and appearance, calling him useless and hopeless, yet admitted he was her only option since no ordinary human could endure her lethal aura. Flabbergasted, he clung to her while complaining that when he asked Shia for advice, she merely gave her blessing for whatever made her happy, leaving him completely helpless. Nearby, the dark-suited man calmly sipped his drink, completely ignoring the young man's desperate cries of frustration over the absurd turn of events. Drawing close once more, she softly confessed that everyone who shared true affection with her was destined to die, except for him, who possessed the unique ability to survive. He suddenly understood the grim reality. Anyone close to her became a target for the curse, forcing him to ask if she was truly out of her mind or simply seeking death. She clarified that she sought neither a marriage nor a genuine family, intending only to raise the child alone and bid him farewell once her goal was met. Looking at her with a blend of pity and disbelief, he questioned if she was genuinely content with such an arrangement, to which she reaffirmed her resolute desire to defy the curse placed upon her. She declared her intention to build a family of her own as an act of ultimate revenge against her fate. Her eyes glinted with fierce determination as she insisted on proving that her life would never play out according to her enemy's design. Unable to stay silent any longer, he exploded in anger, furiously questioning how she could ever think of saddling an innocent child with such heavy baggage. He continued to vent his frustration, angrily rejecting her bizarre offer to become a convenient companion whenever he felt like holding her. Driven to her absolute limit, she cut him off with a desperate shout, commanding him to just shut up and hold her. Her thunderous outburst echoed across the entire establishment, abruptly plunging the bustling tavern into a dead, awkward silence. Shocked by the quiet that followed, he looked at her burning red face and realized with embarrassment that everyone in the room was staring directly at them. He pointed out how ironic it was for her to be flustered now after kissing him so boldly earlier, which only caused her to angrily tell him to drop dead. Completely overwhelmed by humiliation, she slumped onto the bench in a pathetic heap, groaning about how embarrassing it was to beg for affection. He stood over her as she cowered in shame, scratching his cheek nervously before asking what they were supposed to do next. He prodded the slumped dancer, desperately trying to get her to speak and undo the awkward scene she had just created. Before she could offer a response, a terrifying, dark aura materialized behind him, emitting an eerie roar that called out for her big brother. Smiling innocently, the young princess revealed she had felt her brother's presence, while the imposing knight beside her exuded a suffocating pressure that left the boy paralyzed with fear. Stepping forward aggressively, The girl pointed at the dancer and berated her as a shameless thief, demanding she come along to face a thorough interrogation without any excuses. Turning her wrath upon him next, she barked that her useless big brother was coming along as well, sending him into a full-blown panic over the curse of having a younger sister. With a thunderous slam of the tavern doors, the pair were dragged away in disgrace, leaving the remaining patrons dumbfounded by the chaotic whirlwind. Meanwhile, at that very same moment, a cold and ominous gloom settled over the deep woods outside the royal capital. Deep within the shadows, cloaked figures exchanged hushed giggles, content to let their covert assignment proceed undetected. In low whispers, the conspirators discussed the capital's hero, observing with dark intrigue that his soul could not be located anywhere. Gazing across the moonlit glade, they reiterated their grim conclusion. The soul they sought remained entirely missing. A heavy, blood-stained blade rests amidst dark splatters, accompanied by quiet, cold words rationalizing that the act was unavoidable because coin had exchanged hands. Across the ruined chamber, visceral gore covers the floor, carrying a sudden, phantom ache in the chest that accompanies such terrible slaughter. Beside the dripping steel, a stark boundary is drawn in the darkness, sealing the fate of those who existed on the wrong side of the line. Standing side by side amidst the carnage, twin girls lean their foreheads together, tears streaming down their cheeks as they whisper that everything is finally over. Remaining locked in an embrace, they seek solace in each other's presence, letting their shared sorrow wash over them. Reaching out to take hold of each other, they agree it is time to depart from the gruesome scene. Clasping their hands tightly together, the sisters reaffirm their unbreakable bond in the quiet aftermath. Dragging the massive, bloodied weapon behind them, they break into chilling, youthful giggles as they turn away. Their eerie laughter echoes quietly into the night as they vanish past the blood-spattered room. Meanwhile, outside under a peaceful, starlit night sky, men stand watch outside the lodge, completely unaware of the bloody tragedy within. He bowed respectfully with a hand pressed against his chest as the young girl stepped out into the night. The heavy wooden door creaked shut behind them, sealing off the chamber where the bloody work had just been completed. Innocently thanking the little visitors for their visit, he offered them gentle words of praise as they skipped away hand in hand through the courtyard. Moments later, a fellow guard approached to ask about the well-being of Duke Felipe, and he casually reported that everything was completely quiet inside. Unbeknownst to the guards, Millie and Hilda possessed a terrifying power that prevented anyone from recognizing their true presence. Whenever they completed a job, their targets vanished entirely, swallowed up as if erased, leaving behind only piles of mangled flesh. Because of this eerie and unseen lethality, the young twin sisters were spoken of with hushed horror across the lands, feared everywhere as the kidnapping fairies. The demise of Duke Felipe would soon disrupt the delicate balance of power within the kingdom of Froingvale, sparking a storm of conflict. Yet that was a story for another time. Oz awoke exhausted and exasperated, rubbing his head as memories of the chaotic night came flooding back to him. He recalled the bizarre conversation regarding Remurim's intentions and her strange notions about family, leaving him utterly baffled by the absurdity of it all. He listened as she walked beside him through the stone corridor, explaining the heavy burden of her curse and her desperate search for a way to counter what had been stolen from her. Looking down at his clenched fist, he pondered the dark nature of his own curse, realizing that bringing a child into the world might only result in robbing them of something precious. He struggled with the gravity of his circumstances, admitting to himself that he lacked the confidence to face such a cruel fate without causing harm. Returning to his immediate surroundings, he was met with the enthusiastic bows of the household servants, who eagerly promised to manage the estate and serve his every need. As he strolled through the neighborhood, he marveled at how quickly everyone had settled into the new residence, adapting effortlessly despite having arrived merely days ago. Observing the bustling town square around him, a growing sense of unease took root in his mind, convincing him that something fundamental in this world was deeply wrong. His focus shifted to his latest contract regarding Princess Eru, frustrated by the complete lack of clues about who might be targeting her or when an attack would occur. He recognized a subtle loophole in his instructions, Concluding that since preserving the princess's life was not explicitly demanded, he could unleash his full power against anyone who dared to strike. He walked down the quiet corridor, pondering his next move, knowing he needed to get close to the princess as soon as possible for any plan to succeed. As he reached the doorway, Greta was already waiting in full armor, declaring herself the first to report for duty and ready for whatever lay ahead. Seeing her stern readiness, he peeked around the frame with a sweat drop on his brow, muttering quietly that he wished for nothing more than to return home. Driven into action, Greta barked harsh orders at the group, warning that stopping on the battlefield meant death. He panted heavily as he ran, cursing under his breath at the relentless pace while Princess Eru tried her best to keep up. Nearby, the other guards looked on in confusion as he and his royal ward were made to run 2 hours earlier than scheduled, wondering amongst themselves why such extreme physical strain was necessary. As the sun rose over the horizon, he stumbled forward completely spent, anxiously worrying that if he collapsed from exhaustion before resolving the princess's situation, his curse might trigger unexpectedly. Unable to keep his footing any longer, he collapsed face first onto the stone floor with a heavy thud, though he still weakly offered to begin the day's duties. Glaring down at his slumping body, Greta seized him angrily, pointing toward Princess Eru and demanding to know if he felt no shame for putting the delicate royal through such misery. Before he could offer an excuse, she delivered a sudden, violent kick that sent him tumbling across the floor in utter shock. Drawing her blade with terrifying swiftness, she barked at him to stand at attention before Her Highness, leaving him recoiling on the ground in panic over whether this life-threatening shock would unleash his curse. He screamed as heavy, earth-shaking footsteps thundered right behind him, the armored knight relentlessly pursuing him and demanding he stop fleeing. Interrupting the brutal drill, Princess Eru called out for Greta to halt, prompting the knight to quickly stop and protest that Oz was merely exaggerating his suffering. Turning her sharp gaze onto her knight, Princess Eru sternly reprimanded Greta for her harsh treatment, leaving the knight stuttering an apology while the boy watched from the ground. Kneeling beside the collapsed boy, she gently inquired about his condition, relieved that he was safe even as she noted his apparent lack of physical stamina. She stared down at him with an intense, unblinking gaze, causing him to tense under her quiet scrutiny. As she fussed over whether he was injured or unable to stand, he apologized profusely, admitting that his legs had simply given out entirely. She began pondering whether his weakness stemmed from her own shortcomings or perhaps a lack of proper nutrition, leaving him utterly bewildered by her strange reasoning. Interrupting her master's rambling, Greta asserted that knights were supposed to feel boundless strength surging in the presence of royalty, casting doubt on the boy's true potential. With intense fury, the knight proclaimed that the fault lay entirely with him, arguing that he possessed neither the qualifications nor the loyalty required to receive royal favor. Hearing her knight's harsh judgment, the young princess pondered the statement quietly, while the exhausted boy could only groan in misery on the floor. He sat quietly, resting his cheek on his hand as he acknowledged his own lack of talent, admitting with a calm resignation that he simply was not accustomed to receiving royal favor. As Greta glared down at him in open disgust, he maintained that the fault rested entirely on his shoulders for being far less fortunate and capable than those around him. Lightening the mood, he brightly held up a small piece of food, chuckling that taking a few days of rest under the princess's care might actually help him become a decent human being. Her patience instantly snapped at his cheeky remark, and the armored knight bellowed in rage, accusing him of taking shameless advantage of the royal kindness as he cowered in sheer terror. Desperate to escape her wrath, he scampered behind Princess Eru to hide, clinging to her royal dress and squealing for protection as the knight approached. In response, Princess Eru immediately stepped in, shouting for Greta to stand down and fiercely scolding her for bullying someone who had already humbly confessed his own shortcomings. Continuing her stern reprimand, the princess expressed deep disappointment, declaring that she had never expected such heartlessness from her own knight, leaving Greta completely stunned. The harsh words struck the proud knight like a physical blow, leaving her trembling violently with tears in her eyes as the crushing realization dawned on her that she had lost the princess's favor. Completely broken, Greta collapsed onto her knees in despair, while the boy slumped to the floor in overwhelming relief, listening as the princess gently addressed her fallen knight. Addressing the kneeling knight, Princess Eru granted her permission to remain at her side as an attendant for the next few days, prompting Oz to wave his arms in panic, frantically protesting that keeping such a menace nearby was a terrible idea. He watched in mild confusion as Princess Eru confronted her knight, sternly reminding Greta of the true reason for her presence. With a heavy, crestfallen silence, Greta bowed deeply in submission, leaving the young boy to realize that, despite the awkward tension, they had somehow managed to make progress. High-pitched screams echoing down the distant stone corridors broke the heavy atmosphere of the castle, a stark contrast to the quiet hall nearby. Inside the quiet room, the young princess relaxed on her ornate seat, while her companion sat casually on the floor before her, remarking how enjoyable it was to finally have someone willing to listen so attentively to her talk. He chuckled sheepishly, admitting that his attentive demeanor was merely a desperate attempt to satisfy her quickly and avoid a tedious scolding, an honesty that only made the mood lighter. Remembering the chaotic days when he was relentlessly chased by terrifying women through the city, he genuinely considered listening to her gentle ramblings to be an absolute paradise by comparison. Turning her gaze downward, she gently confessed that despite finding her current situation somewhat unreal, her true wish was simply to be of use to her father, the king, which was why she had requested her assignment with the Eastgate Knights. As the conversation turned to the looming threat of war, the young noblewoman expressed her desire to fulfill her royal duty, while he pondered his own assigned role of protecting her as part of the guard force. Clasping her small hands together nervously, she questioned what the true purpose of royalty ought to be if steering the nation through crisis was out of her reach. He listened thoughtfully, reflecting on the rumors that King Benedict was a gentle yet indecisive ruler, leaving him to wonder what hidden motives lay behind the monarch's quiet surface. Recalling a moment earlier when she had been overcome with emotion, she embarrassedly admitted that she had wept quietly in the corridor before gathering herself to speak with him. She went on to recount how, later that night, Lord Sykes, the commander of the Royal Guard, had paid an unexpected visit to her private chambers to discuss matters of gravity. She listened quietly as the reality of the impending war was laid out before her, understanding that boosting the morale of the garrison knights had become a pressing necessity. Following this explanation, the proposal was made to send an escort to accompany her to the East Gate, prompting her to question the necessity of her direct involvement. When she asked if merely being present would suffice, she was assured that for those devoted to the royal family, simply beholding her would inspire boundless strength and raise their spirits far beyond normal training. Hearing this account, the young boy pieced the puzzle together in his mind, realizing why a top-tier female knight like Greta had been assigned to serve both as her personal guard and escort for the mission. Settling back onto the floor, he remarked on how clear it all was, finally understanding why she had taken up residence in such a secluded location so soon after the head of the guard's passing. Yet suspicion lingered in his mind, prompting him to ask why the commander had bothered visiting her late at night just to explain all this, suspecting the man harbored hidden doubts about her resolve. In response to his questioning, she locked her gaze onto him with unwavering seriousness, telling him that he should see the truth for himself. With quiet resolve, she challenged him to determine through his own eyes whether she was truly worthy of receiving his loyalty. Her bold challenge left the young boy utterly speechless, his eyes widening in shock as the weight of her words settled upon him. Slumping back with a deep exhale, he could only sigh in defeat, fully aware of the daunting burden he had just agreed to carry over the coming days. He had believed he was steering their conversation all along, only to realize he was merely dancing in the palm of the young princess's hand. A cold sweat broke out as a sudden, startling realization began to form in his mind. Never had he imagined that someone so young could demonstrate such a formidable gap in sheer caliber and presence. Standing before her, he wrestled with his true identity. As an assassin, offering genuine loyalty to the crown was impossible, yet allowing a girl like her to meet her end would haunt his conscience forever. With a hardened gaze, he reached a firm conclusion. Leaving her to live or die on her own was simply out of the question, forcing him to reconsider his detachment. As the immediate danger subsided, the companions began piecing together the sinister plot surrounding the attack on Princess Eru, questioning who could have sent the assailants and why someone would try to frame or manipulate the head guard. Because of these unresolved doubts, Greta remained deeply suspicious, noting that while the princess placed immense trust in her captain, the presence of the mysterious boy was a dangerous variable that made no sense. With their discussion drawing to a close, she firmly declared that it was time to return to the royal palace, where Princess Eru sat calmly awaiting their departure. However, as the knight turned to leave, she gasped in horror upon realizing that the princess intended to bring the suspicious youth along with them to the palace. In response to her knight's outburst, the young princess brightly countered that she wished to learn more about royal affairs and wanted nothing more than to converse with her savior. Hearing this grand declaration, the boy nervously tried to object, stammering that his stay at the post was meant to be temporary, but she blithely ignored his protests, assigning him to be her round-the-clock bodyguard for the next few days. Overwhelmed by the utter absurdity of the arrangement, the knight grabbed the reluctant youth by the shoulders, desperately pleading with her sovereign to reconsider inviting such a questionable figure into the royal quarters. Turning her wide, sparkling eyes toward her frantic guardian, the innocent princess softly asked if there was truly any reason to hesitate when doing something good. Confronted by such absolute, blinding goodwill, she stood utterly speechlessly defeated, powerless to counter the pure intentions of the child as they set off toward the royal palace. While she was busy claiming her new bodyguard, across the city at roughly the same time, Remurum stepped out into a quiet alleyway and sighed heavily. Turning to her sharp-dressed companion, she made it clear that her current interaction was merely a temporary pause before she had to return to her duties. Listening quietly, he weighed their options in silence, contemplating whether taking direct action regarding the girl was their best remaining course. Because obtaining her true goal left her no alternative, she reconfirmed her focus, knowing the boy was the sole key to her success. As she walked, she pondered the recent turn of events and the strange statements made, trying to make sense of what had transpired. Her heels clicked firmly against the stone floor as she navigated the narrow corridor, leaving the conversation behind. Beneath her composed demeanor, sheer embarrassment washed over her at the thought of facing work after making such a public spectacle. Looking across at the young boy, she mentally conceded defeat, realizing that maintaining a cold exterior before him was completely impossible. He listened in shock as she openly confessed her feelings, admitting that thoughts of him had consumed her until she could no longer hold back. Overcome with desperation and shame, she dropped to her knees and bowed low, begging for his mercy and understanding. As she strode purposefully through the bustling town square, the dancer caught the eye of a familiar curly-haired acquaintance in a dark dress, who instantly winced upon being spotted. Ignoring her attempt to slip past silently, the young woman rushed forward while vigorously shaking a donation box, loudly demanding charity for underprivileged children. Seizing the opportunity, Giselle put on a dramatically earnest expression, pleading that her younger brothers were facing severe hardship this month and desperately needed financial aid. Reminding her companion of the exact same story she had concocted in the past, the dancer openly questioned the validity of the excuse, leaving the young woman flustered as she scrambled to defend her lie. With a heavy sigh, she yielded to the persistence and tossed a small pouch of coins over, which the young woman caught deftly with a bright, triumphant grin. After pocketing the money, the two began walking side by side along the stone path, shifting their focus to the true reason behind their meeting. Leaning in with lively curiosity, Giselle urged her to spill whatever urgent matter had prompted her to seek out advice so suddenly. Unexpectedly catching her tongue, Remurum stammered and averted her gaze, her unusual shyness causing her companion to look on with deep bewilderment. Turning back with a deadpan yet intensely serious gaze, she blurted out a startling query about whether her companion had ever been embraced by a man, leaving the clergywoman completely stunned. She couldn't hold back her amusement, her sudden laughter overflowing from the quiet room and breaking the peaceful calm of the evening outside. Doubled over in fits of hysterical giggles, she offered a playful apology while admitting how hilarious she found the situation regarding the trashy man who had backed her companion into a corner. As the laughter subsided, The priestess let out a heavy sigh and confessed the truth of her predicament. Due to a rare bodily condition, she was unable to conceive children with an ordinary human. Blushing deeply, the priestess fumbled through an explanation of her confusing feelings about romance and desire, struggling to make sense of her own conflicting emotions. Intrigued by this admission, the dancer pressed further, bluntly asking why she would want to have a child with a man she didn't even know if she truly cared for. This probing question brought forth memories of the young orphans gathered around the dining table, reminding her of their shared condition as souls without parents. Absorbing these earnest words, she took a quiet sip from her cup, thoughtfully considering what it truly meant to crave a normal family dynamic. Expanding on her thoughts, the priestess noted that while typical families are bound by blood, those in her shelter were complete strangers brought together by circumstance. Imagining the lively home filled with parentless children she cared for daily, she acknowledged her lack of formal education but insisted that blood ties were not the only thing that created connection. Turning to her guest with an affectionate and unwavering expression, she declared with absolute conviction that she viewed all those parentless children as her true family. She laughed softly, waving off the weight of the moment as if blood ties were ultimately trivial after all. Listening to her as the conversation quieted within the estate, that inexplicable desire to gaze upon the boy's face hung heavy in the quiet air. Meanwhile, far from the estate, the young warrior found himself standing alongside Princess Eru, Tenchi, and Greta before the looming gates of the grand royal palace. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead as the overwhelming gravity of where they were fully registered in his mind. Stepping inside the lavishly decorated hall, he could hardly process that they had actually entered the royal castle, while Tenchi calmly ordered the waiting butler to prepare adjoining chambers and meals for the group. Under the piercing, icy glares of the palace retainers, the boy withered, remembering that even back when he served as a lowly guard, he had never felt so utterly out of place. When the young princess attempted to speak to the elderly head butler, the old servant politely but firmly cut her off, insisting that no special mind be paid to formalities regarding him. Escorted by the solemn servants, the small group walked down the immense, vaulted corridor of the majestic palace. Their journey through the hallway brought them before a pair of heavy double doors, intricately carved and looming at the end of the passage. He slumped his shoulders in sheer exhaustion, desperately wishing he could just go home. The terrifying memory of Greta in full armor, threatening to strike down anyone who made a wrong move, still weighed heavily on his mind. Interrupting his gloomy thoughts, a sharp clanking echoed down the corridor as the attendant unlatched the heavy entrance. Beside him, Princess Eru raised her head in mild surprise at the sudden sound. As the grand doors swung wide, a towering figure in brilliant, silver-embossed armor stood bathed in light, Commander Sykes alongside Belmont. Seeing the stern, imposing knight commander before him, the boy gasped in sheer shock. Arriving on the scene, Commander Sykes Belmont carried an air of effortless authority that commanded the attention of everyone present. Seeing him, Princess Eru immediately recognized the high-ranking knight commander, while the surrounding guards fell silent in his grand presence. As the conversation unfolded, details of his reputation came to light, painting him as a remarkably perceptive strategist within the royal guard who possessed a keen eye for potential. She turned her gaze back to her young companion with a warm and gentle smile, genuinely impressed by how perceptive he truly was. Hearing her high praise, he rubbed the back of his head with a sheepish chuckle, modest despite her admiring words. He interjected with an amused smile, finding the interaction between the princess and the young boy rather entertaining, while Greta stood beside him with a look of utter disbelief and irritation. He unexpectedly extended an invitation to IR, suggesting that the young boy sit for the upcoming entrance examination, emphasizing that the royal guard was a true meritocracy. The proposal left both IR and Greta completely stunned, with Greta crying out in absolute shock at the thought of him joining their ranks. She vehemently protested to her commander, calling IR nothing more than useless trash who would bring shame to their proud squad. Unfazed by her outburst, the commander simply chuckled heartily, teasingly suggesting that the boy might even end up becoming her superior one day. He addressed her directly in a calm, yet firm tone, quietly reminding her of her own noble lineage and duty to maintain composure. Under his intense, steady gaze, her fiery protest instantly withered, leaving her stammering nervously and flustered. She shot a terrifying, venomous glare directly at IR, her eyes burning with intense rivalry and resentment. The young boy could only stare back with an awkward, bewildered expression, thoroughly intimidated by her overwhelming malice. He offered a polite farewell to Princess Eru before taking his leave, offering one final encouraging word to IR and expressing high expectations for his future test. As the commander and his subordinate walked away, IR and the princess watched them depart into the distance. As he departed, a heavy tension remained in his wake, leaving the young boy to laugh sheepishly in an attempt to break the awkward silence until an attendant announced that dinner was prepared for the princess. Hearing this, she brightened up immediately and warmly invited him to join her for the meal, catching both him and his companion entirely off guard. Before long, a lavish spread of gourmet dishes was presented before them in the grand dining room, prompting her to clasp her hands with joy as she delightedly exclaimed that she had never experienced such a wonderful dinner. She continued to chatter happily about the sweet fragrance of the garden roses, expressing regret that her busy brother could not enjoy them, before fondly speaking of the wild birds that visited her window each morning. He listened in quiet contemplation while eating, softly repeating her words with a tinge of heartache at how simple her definition of fun truly was. Looking across the vast expanse of the dining table that kept them so far apart, he tentatively asked whether she ever shared a meal with her brother, the Emperor. Her cheerful demeanor faltered as she quietly admitted his duties kept him far too busy, sparking a wave of indignation in the boy as he reflected on how even common folk eat together as a true family. He recalled his own lively household back home, where meals were chaotic, warm, and shared amongst everyone, openly questioning if people who never eat together could truly call themselves a family. A sudden silence washed over the grand hall, drawing painful attention to the young girl sitting alone at the far end of the immense dining table. She sat quietly amid the vast emptiness of the room, her small hands resting near her plate in silent resignation. She seemed almost like a miniature doll trapped within a grand box, sitting alone before her massive spread of food. The lavish imperial palace around her felt less like a home and more like an ornate cage designed to lock her away from the outside world. Despite her cheerful laughter and bright smile, he rested his chin in his hand, quietly contemplating the subtle sadness behind her joyous facade. Once the dinner ended, he offered his polite thanks to the attendants and was guided down the quiet hallway toward his assigned guest quarters. Walking with his arms behind his head, he wondered if his blunt remarks during dinner had crossed a line, considering her high status. Entering the room, he looked around at the modest furnishings, relieved to finally have a moment of solitude to rest. Suddenly, the heavy door slammed open as the armored knight Greta entered, announcing sternly that she would be sharing the room to keep him under constant surveillance. Flopping onto the mattress in disbelief, he complained loudly about the awkwardness of sharing a bedroom with a warrior, unable to settle down under her stern gaze. Turning to face her, he admitted that he hadn't slept at all the previous night due to all the chaotic events, trying to break the heavy tension. He jokingly asked if she wasn't worried about being targeted in her sleep, but quickly remembered her formidable strength, leaving her thoroughly unimpressed by his banter. He had trembled with fear during the council, yet now lay sprawled out on his bed without a care in the world, leaving Greta to marvel at his bizarre lack of self-preservation. As they settled into the quiet night, the young boy began asking about the higher-ups in the guard, curious why the commander seemed so distant. Greta explained that during times of conflict, the kingdom's military factions were deeply divided over which foreign alliance to join. Expanding on the conflict, she detailed how a revolution months prior had split the region between the Republic of Terre and the royalist states of Goa and Mirabel. Joining Terre meant entering a grueling war of attrition, while backing the monarchies seemed like the safer path to stability. She concluded that Commander Sykes strongly favored aligning with Terre, believing it to be the honorable choice despite the immense risks involved. She went on to describe the council's intense debates, where rival nobles clashed over trade routes, military treaties, and the looming threat of neighboring powers like Calcutta, leaving the kingdom on a razor's edge. Yet despite her passionate explanation of statecraft, a soft snore broke her concentration. The boy had drifted soundly off to sleep, provoking an indignant shout from the dutiful knight. Her anger quickly gave way to a quiet, bemused sigh as she stared down at her sleeping companion. Watching his peaceful face, she couldn't help but smile slightly, marveling at just how peculiar the young boy truly was. Meanwhile, beneath the cover of pitch-black darkness, silent figures slunk through the alleys of the royal capital of Santogon, moving undetected toward their target. Reports whispered among the shadows confirmed that assassins from Calcutta had successfully breached the royal perimeter, setting their sights directly on the manor. Beyond its public reputation as a resource-rich region producing rare ores, Calcutta harbors a darker identity as the base of operations for a shadowy syndicate known as the Snake's Eye. Within the quiet shadows, senior members of the syndicate discuss the recent uninvited guests who have trespassed onto their turf, refusing to let rival killers act without consequence. A young informant reports that the infiltrators were tracked entering a warehouse belonging to the Slayman Merchant Guild, a prominent group known for supplying the royal court. They note that the guild has recently been buying massive quantities of food and weaponry from neighboring states, stoking fears that a major conflict is looming. Examining the procurement records further, they notice an abnormally high volume of salt purchases, realizing that intentional hoarding is what caused recent market prices to skyrocket. Receiving his instructions, the youth is ordered to maintain strict surveillance on the target codenamed Silver Cat. The commander commands that every available assassin be mobilized immediately, sensing a deep and ominous plot taking shape in the capital. He commits the target's name to memory, fully aware of the grave responsibility resting on his shoulders. Outside the high manor windows under the moonlit sky, the peaceful facade of the realm hides the truth that surface politics and underworld power struggles are inextricably linked. As he rests fitfully, he senses that the underworld cannot remain uninvolved, while far in the distance, a destructive storm prepares to break over them all. As Tart sat quietly in deep reflection, the looming shadow of the mysterious man from the dark echoed in his mind. Nearby on the training grounds, Greta boldly challenged the entire group of knight trainees to attack her all at once. Without breaking a sweat, she unleashed a whirlwind of violent strikes, instantly sending every single recruit flying across the yard in agony. Watching the carnage from the sidelines alongside Princess Eru, he casually remarked on the female knight's monstrous strength. Having thoroughly crushed her opponents, she turned her sharp, confident gaze directly toward him. Catching her fierce glare, he felt an immediate wave of dread wash over him. She suddenly pointed toward him, declaring loudly that it was time to teach that dead-eyed boy a proper lesson. He immediately protested the sudden challenge, but the princess only smiled, thoroughly amused by the confrontation. Smirking back at him, she mockingly offered to switch to real blades if he wanted a true test. Delighted by the escalating tension, Princess Eru eagerly cheered her on to show no mercy. She watched on with amusement as the defeated recruits mobbed the young boy, cheering for him to avenge them against Greta. Surprised by their sudden enthusiasm, he struggled to comprehend why they were placing all their hopes on his shoulders. As the fallen knights practically lifted him in celebration and urged him to take down their formidable rival, he tried in vain to push them away, flustered by the overwhelming commotion. Sensing an opportunity to test her skills further, the female knight charged forward in a swift blur, closing the distance between them in the blink of an eye. Towering over him with a provocative smirk, she teased him about how she should handle him, leaving him sweating with anxiety at her intimidating presence. Their confrontation was abruptly interrupted when a stern, regal voice cut through the air, criticizing the ridiculous spectacle and causing her to instantly freeze in her tracks. Turning toward the newcomer, the young swordsman immediately recognized the tall, elegant nobleman in dark tailored attire who had stepped into the courtyard. Whispers spread among the recruits, identifying him as Lord Aramis, while Princess Eru greeted him affectionately as her brother, only for him to coldly dismiss her pleasantries as a waste of time. Surprised by his harsh tone, the princess listened as onlookers quietly discussed his background, revealing he was the third prince, neglected in distant lands, and the only full-blood brother sharing her mother. Casting a sharp, calculating glance in their direction, the prince appeared far from typical royalty, having abandoned his noble status to join the ranks as a notorious troublemaker within the kingdom. Pondering the complex dynamics between the royal siblings, the young protagonist realized that this unpredictable prince was now involved, adding a dangerous new element to the situation unfolding before them. He stood silently as Prince Aramis unleashed a scolding tirade, accusing the assembled guards of mocking their duty and letting their self-righteous idealism place an unfair burden on everyone around them. Driven into a corner by his biting words, Greta grit her teeth in silent frustration, unable to refute his cold assertion that no one present had the resolve to turn the nobility into an enemy. Spreading his arms in a grand, dismissive gesture, the prince turned his cold gaze directly upon Princess Eru, declaring that her helpless tears served no purpose whatsoever. As tears welled in the young princess's eyes, he mercilessly instructed her to retreat to the inner palace and play with dolls like a useless figurehead, a harsh rebuke that Tart observed with growing intensity. With a final sharp remark directed at the overly sympathetic knights, Aramis stepped forward, leaving Greta fuming and Eru completely crestfallen in the wake of his cruelty. Breaking the heavy silence, the white-haired boy stretched his arms casually behind his head and began strolling away, ignoring Greta's indignant shouts as he dismissed the sentimental drama. Aramis continued his harsh monologue, confessing his deep distaste for spoiled fools who weep despite possessing an innocent, loving sister, even as the carefree youth crossed his path. Halting his stride, Tart turned toward the noble with a cheerful, unnerving grin and casually asked if he could ask a quick question, drawing a cold, skeptical glare from the prince. As Greta nervously interjected to remind him of his place as a mere guard, Aramis warned the boy that his disrespectful attitude crossed into treason, though the youth remained entirely unbothered. With a mockingly friendly smile, Tart pointedly noted that since Aramis was no longer officially registered among the royal family, there was no need for him to act like a protective big brother, a bold provocation that caused the prince's eye to twitch in shock. He defended his stance passionately, insisting that he had no desire to defy royalty merely for pleasure, but rather because his honest nature simply would not allow him to stand by. Behind him, the armored guards drew their steel in outrage at his brazen impudence. Turning his back with contempt, the noble dismissed the youth's outburst as nothing more than the coarse rambling of an unrefined peasant. Rather than being intimidated, the spiky-haired youth offered a wry chuckle, admitting that while he was secretly trembling with fear in the presence of royalty, certain principles were non-negotiable. His gaze sharpened into pure resolve as he declared that, if nothing else, he possessed the courage to protect a younger sister. This quiet declaration struck a nerve, darkening the former prince's face with sinister fury as both the young princess and her guardian knight watched in stunned silence. Enraged by the insult, the aristocrat roared for his guards to punish the impudent commoner, while the young strategist calmly calculated that enduring a mere beating was a small price to pay to avoid treason charges. Standing firm against the oncoming threat, he maintained his resolute posture, convinced that someone desperately needed to shatter the former royal's delusion of superiority. As the soldiers charged forward with bared weapons, ready to strike him down, the air shattered with sudden, explosive movement. The Knight Commander Greta intervened with violent precision, mercilessly intercepting and flattening the guards before they could reach their target. Bowing with exaggerated, sarcastic politeness, she offered a mocking apology to the royal guest, while systematically wiping out his remaining men, sternly warning him to know his place. She stood unyielding as the third prince wiped a trail of bile from his mouth, sneering that he would yield for the day solely out of deference to her authority. Before making his exit, he turned to issue one final bitter reminder that the fragile princess remained utterly useless, slamming the heavy wooden door behind him. As the sound of footsteps echoed down the grand corridor, a collective sigh of exhaustion washed over the room. Relieved that the immediate danger had passed, the young boy offered a sheepish apology to the princess for involving her in the altercation, though she gently insisted that no apology was necessary. Without warning, a heavy armored hand struck his shoulder, shattering the moment of calm as a harsh voice labeled him an absolute fool. Seizing him firmly by the collar, she yanked him close and bellowed in rage, demanding to know if he possessed a death wish by directly defying a royal prince like Aramis. Her eyes burned with intense fury as she made it brutally clear that defying such power was tantamount to begging for execution. Rubbing his sore shoulder with a wry smile, he mused aloud about how unfair it was to receive a brutal scolding right after doing an honest day's work. She snapped right back that risking his life wasn't work but outright suicide, prompting him to casually wave off her reprimand with a half-hearted promise to be careful next time. Suddenly, she leaned in dangerously close until their faces were inches apart, her sharp gaze freezing him instantly in place as the tone between them shifted entirely. She pressed her face dangerously close to his, her sharp, glaring gaze pinning him in place as he stammered in utter shock. Unable to contain her exasperation, she barked straight into his face, fiercely demanding to know what was with his blank, clueless expression. As the crushing tension finally broke, the exhausted young apprentice collapsed backward onto the floor, completely drained by the intense confrontation. While the young princess watched silently with gentle concern in her eyes, the boy could only sit wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. Shaking him violently, the hot-tempered knight resumed her rant, calling him a hopeless piece of junk for recklessly provoking royal authority. Once order was somewhat restored, he raised a suspicious question, reasoning that a high prince like Aramis would never bother visiting a mere guard outpost without a hidden motive. Hearing his point, the princess cast her eyes down in sorrow, softly confessing her quiet belief that her elder brother simply hated her. Far from their sight, a sinister shadow loomed over the prince's true intentions, leaving his cold and scheming nature veiled in ominous silence.